Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. It was the summer of 1957, and our town had just opened its first drive-in theater. They built it on an empty stretch of land at the edge of the county, just a gravel lot with a giant white screen set up against the tree line. People came from all over, farm families in their pickups, kids piling into the backs of Fords and Chevys, young couples looking for some privacy. I went with my friend Ray on the second weekend they had it running. He had an old Plymouth sedan, roomy enough that we could stretch our legs, and he insisted the sound was better through the little speaker boxes you hooked on your window than on any regular radio. That night was warm and still. No wind, no clouds, just the sort of heavy air that made your shirt stick to your back. The movie they were showing was Forbidden Planet, which felt like a big deal, something flashy and modern for a place like ours. The gravel lot was nearly full when we arrived. Kids were running between the cars with paper bags of popcorn, parents honking their horns to quiet them down. We parked halfway back, not too close to the screen, not so far that the figures looked tiny. While we waited for the sun to set, Ray got out and wandered over to the snack stand. I stayed put, watching the rows of cars pulling in, the beams of headlights sweeping across the dust. That was when I noticed him. It was a black Mercury coupe parked all by itself in the far corner, away from everyone else. The man inside was alone. He hadn't bothered to pull up near the other cars, just sat angled toward the screen as if the show didn't matter much to him anyway. What caught me was the way he was sitting perfectly upright, hands resting on the wheel even though the engine wasn't running. Everyone else was chatting, leaning out of their windows or fiddling with the speaker cables. He just stared straight ahead. Ray came back balancing 2 bottles of soda and a cardboard tray of popcorn. I didn't mention the man right away, but I kept glancing over in that direction. Even when the cartoon preview reel started, the guy didn't move. The movie began a little after 9. As the opening credits rolled across the screen, that's when something strange happened. At first, I thought it was part of the show, some special effect from the projector, but it wasn't. A line of lights, maybe 6 or 7, came gliding silently over the theater. They weren't like plane lights, no blinking, no sound, just a row of glowing orbs drifting in a perfect line. They passed directly overhead, slow and smooth, like they were following some path none of us could see. Nobody reacted. That's what unsettled me the most. Hundreds of people sitting in their cars, kids squealing over their sodas, teenagers laughing, and not a single head tilted up. It was as if they couldn't see it, except him. The man in the Mercury had tilted his face toward the sky the moment the lights appeared. His expression was hard to read from where I was, but there was no shock, no pointing or calling out like I wanted to. He looked like he had been waiting for them. I nudged Ray, whispered for him to look. He glanced around, confused, then shrugged and stuffed more popcorn in his mouth. "What are you talking about?" he said. The lights were still overhead, bright as lanterns, and he didn't see a thing. By the time they drifted past the tree line, disappearing soundlessly into the distance, my hands were damp from gripping the soda bottle too hard. I leaned out my window toward the Mercury. The man hadn't moved. He just lowered his gaze back to the screen and stayed there, still and calm, like nothing unusual had happened. The movie kept playing. Laughter, horns honking, the smell of buttered popcorn carried on the heavy air. Everything normal, except me and that man in the corner. I tried to focus on the film, but I couldn't shake it. Every time the light from the projector swept across the lot, I'd catch a glimpse of his profile. Sharp, pale in the glow, never changing. Halfway through the picture, I noticed he still hadn't touched the speaker box. No sound was coming from his car. He wasn't watching the movie the way the rest of us were. His eyes would drift upward every so often, toward the empty sky above the screen, as though expecting something else. Near the end of the show, people started engines early, some ready to beat the traffic. Ray leaned over to ask if I wanted to grab a burger afterward. I said sure, though my stomach was in knots. When the credits rolled, Horns honked, and cars pulled out in long lines toward the exit road. Dust hung low across the headlights. I glanced one last time toward the corner. The Mercury was gone. No engine noise, no headlights moving through the lot, just gone. I told myself he must have slipped out during the commotion at the end, but I hadn't seen him leave, and I'd been watching for it. On the drive back, Ray kept laughing about a scene from the movie, doing an impression of the robot. I nodded along, but barely heard him. The night air through the open window felt too cool on my face. When we passed the county road where the drive-in lights were still visible behind us, I caught myself scanning the sky, half expecting that line of orbs to reappear. I didn't say anything to Ray about the man in the Mercury. He wouldn't have believed me, not when he hadn't seen the lights either. But I remember the look on that man's face, steady, almost calm, as though the rest of us were only background noise, and the real show was happening above us. I went back to the drive-in a few more times that summer. Saw westerns, comedies, even a horror picture. I never saw that Mercury again. Sometimes I'd park near the back row just to check the corners, but it was always empty, and I never saw those lights again either. But I can still picture that row of glowing orbs sliding soundlessly over the lot, and that single man watching them with the kind of quiet attention that made it feel less like a surprise and more like a meeting he'd been expecting all along. I was walking home from school one afternoon in '52 in a small town out in western Kansas when I first noticed the chalk drawings. At first, I thought it was just a kid doodling, maybe some kind of game. They were strange, though, like nothing I'd ever seen. Sharp angles, almost like a broken circle with little lines radiating from it. I stopped and looked at it for a moment, then kept walking. By the next day, more of them had appeared on the sidewalks near the tracks. I asked a few of the kids in my class about them. Nobody knew how they got there. One girl, Clara Jensen, said, "The man by the tracks showed me." She said it like it was normal. I asked her what she meant, but she just shrugged and stared at her shoes. The tracks weren't far from town, just past the old grain elevator. No trains had run on that line for years. At first, I didn't think much of it, but more drawings kept showing up. Not just near the tracks, by the corner store in front of the school, even on my own street. Every kid I spoke to said the same thing. The man by the tracks. None of them could describe him clearly. Some said he wore a long coat. Some said he had a hat pulled low, but nobody remembered a face. One evening, I stayed out later than usual. I wanted to see if I could spot this man myself. The town was quiet, almost too quiet. The street lamps cast dim pools of light that didn't reach very far, and the wind had started to pick up, carrying that dry, dusty smell from the fields. I walked toward the tracks slowly. I don't know why. I wasn't thinking. When I got there, I didn't see anyone at first. Just the tracks, the grain elevator, and a few chalk symbols on the ground. Then I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond the line of the lamplight. It was tall, thin, standing perfectly still. I froze. I could hear the wind whistling, the faint rustle of leaves. I wanted to call out, but my voice didn't come. I watched for a while. The shadow didn't move in any normal way, if you can call it normal. There was no sway from the wind, nothing. Just a still, solid shape. I blinked, and it seemed farther back than it had been a second before. I turned quickly to run, but nothing looked familiar. When I glanced back, the figure was gone. The next day at school, more chalk drawings had appeared. Exactly the same symbol, over and over. I noticed something else. The kids who drew them didn't seem to remember doing it. I asked Tommy Harper about one he had made the night before, and he looked at me like I was crazy. "I didn't do that," he said. "I was inside." But I'd seen the drawing myself, fresh and bright on the sidewalk. Over the next week, I started paying attention to the kids more than anything else. They would sometimes pause mid-step and stare toward the tracks, even if no one was there. I caught Clara Jensen doing it once. She was holding her chalk in the air, looking straight at nothing, then suddenly she would start drawing, repeating the symbol over and over without a word. I tried asking her what she saw, but she couldn't answer, just whispered, "He comes by the tracks." It got harder to ignore after I saw the symbol myself. One afternoon, I was walking home past the grain elevator, and the chalk was already there, freshly drawn, though no kid was around. I bent down to touch it. The lines felt almost wet, though it hadn't rained. My fingers left no mark. I stepped back and looked around. Nothing. Nobody. I started noticing other things too. Small sounds, mostly. Scratches, whispers that stopped when I turned my head, and lights along the tracks at night. They weren't like normal lamps, just small points of light hovering low over the ground, moving slowly. I thought maybe it was a reflection or someone with a lantern, but it made no sense. The tracks were abandoned. One evening, I decided I would see him, whoever he was. I walked past the grain elevator, the wind biting at my ears. The lights appeared again, floating along the rails. I held my breath and kept walking, trying not to make a sound. I reached the spot where the chalk symbol had first appeared, and then I saw him, or I thought I did. He stood just past the tracks, tall and straight, coat dark against the fading sun. No hat this time. His head was tilted slightly, like he was studying something. I wanted to call out, but my throat tightened. I tried to step closer and the lights flickered, almost like they were shy. I froze, looking from the figure to the tracks and back. Then he was gone. Not walking away, not turning around, just gone, like someone had snatched the air from around him. The next morning, more chalk symbols were on the sidewalks, closer to the houses this time. I asked my mother if she'd seen them. She said, "It's just the children playing, Richard. Don't worry about it." But she was lying, I could tell. She'd seen the same thing. I spent a lot of time watching after that. I didn't sleep well. Every night, I would hear faint whispers along the tracks, and sometimes I would see shapes moving just beyond the lamplight. Not fast, slow, deliberate, careful, always just out of reach. And the chalk symbol kept appearing, as if someone was marking a path, though to where I couldn't tell. One afternoon, I saw Clara and Tommy walking toward the tracks. They weren't talking, just staring straight ahead. I followed from a distance. They stopped, bent down, and traced the symbol into the dirt with sticks. Then they walked away like nothing had happened. I touched the ground where they had drawn. No chalk, no trace at all. A few weeks later, my father came home from town with a story. The older men in the bar had been talking. One claimed he saw strange lights near the tracks, moving against the wind, shifting as if alive. Another said he had found symbols etched in the dirt near the elevator, but they disappeared by morning. I didn't say anything. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want them thinking I had lost my mind. Eventually, the chalk drawing slowed down. Kids still mentioned the man by the tracks, but they stopped drawing the symbol as much. I kept walking past the tracks anyway, though, because I couldn't stop. Sometimes when the wind was right, I could swear I saw a figure at the edge of my vision, just standing there, watching, silent. The tracks were empty, but I could feel him. I never got close enough to see a face, and nobody else ever did either. Sometimes the lights would appear, faint and low over the rails, hovering, moving slowly, disappearing when you blinked. I started leaving small pieces of chalk out near the sidewalks, thinking maybe I could catch it in action. The chalk would be gone in the morning, drawn into the symbol by someone or something, but I never saw how it happened. I moved away from town the next year. My father got a job elsewhere. Before I left, I walked the tracks one last time. The chalk symbol was there, faint but clear. I traced it with my fingers once more. Nothing happened. No lights, no whispers. Just the dry wind over the rails and the dust of the abandoned track bed. I've been back once since, decades later. The town had changed, houses moved or torn down, the grain elevator gone. I walked past the tracks. Nothing. No chalk, no figure, no lights. Just an empty track bed cutting through the fields. But I know it was real. I know the children didn't just imagine it. Even now, when I think about it, I see the symbol in my mind. Sharp angles, broken circle, lines radiating. Sometimes I dream about it, floating over the rails at night. And I swear, if I ever hear that faint scratch of chalk against pavement or see a shadow at the edge of my vision, I still pause, just in case the man by the tracks has come back. I was on duty at the old Point Lighthouse in 1953, working the midnight to dawn shift. The fog had rolled in thick that evening, smothering the coast. and the beam from the lighthouse cut through it like a knife. I'd been at the station for 5 years by then, seen plenty of storms and rough seas, but nothing like what happened that night. I was sweeping the light across the water when something caught my eye, a glint, a reflection right at the edge of the beam. I paused, thinking maybe it was a floating barrel or a piece of driftwood, but the shine was too steady, too solid. No ship was scheduled to pass that night. The shipping logs had been checked that afternoon, and nothing was expected until morning. I grabbed my binoculars and trained them on the glint. That's when I saw it. Not a ship, not a buoy, something massive hovering just above the water. It had a shape, vaguely triangular, but the edges weren't crisp like metal plating. They were soft, almost like it was carved from shadows. No lights, no running lights, no smokestack, nothing. Just the dark outline against the gray fog. I lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, then looked again. It hadn't moved. I checked the horizon. No fog bank could have been holding it up. I watched it for several minutes. Every time my beam swept over it, the reflection would flare briefly off its surface, then disappear. I tried to convince myself it was some reflection of the lighthouse itself, bouncing off a wave, but the reflection stayed even when the water below it was dark. I picked up the radio to call the Coast Guard. My hand hovered over the transmitter. What would I even say? Something big and black is hovering off the coast? I set the radio down. The last thing I wanted was to sound like I'd lost my mind. I went out onto the balcony to get a better view, leaning over the railing as the wind whipped around me. That's when I noticed something else, a faint, low hum. Not loud, more like a vibration through the air than a sound. I turned, checked the machinery inside the lighthouse. Everything was normal. The generator was steady, the lamps fine, the foghorn idle. But the hum, it was coming from the direction of the shape. I kept the binoculars trained on it, watching. Slowly, it began to drift closer, or maybe I was imagining it. It didn't slice through the fog like a boat. It moved like it was part of the fog itself, sliding along with it. My stomach sank. I knew how fast currents could shift, how fog could fool the eye, but I could see clear breaks in the mist where it passed. It had mass. Something solid and enormous was out there. I glanced at the water for signs of waves or a bow pushing through. Nothing. No wake, no whitecaps forming around a hull. The water was calm, almost eerily still around it. The next thing I noticed was the way it blocked the light. The beam would hit the fog, and then suddenly there'd be a shadow, a dark space where the light didn't reach. The rest of the fog would glow, but that section stayed black. I moved the beam carefully, sweeping left and right, up and down. The shadow stayed aligned with the shape. It wasn't an optical trick. I kept thinking I'd blink and it would be gone, but it didn't go. And then I noticed something subtle. The horizon felt wrong, like the ocean's edge wasn't as far away as it should be. My eyes kept flicking from the shape to the distant lighthouse keeper house on the other point. It felt like the world had shifted slightly just around that thing. Time started to feel strange. I wasn't sure how long I had been watching, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. The hum never changed. No sound of engines, no bird calls, nothing. Even the foghorn was silent, or maybe I didn't hear it. I considered heading down to the dock to see if I could get a closer look, but the thought of walking along the slick, foggy rocks in darkness made my pulse quicken. I stayed where I was, gripping the railing, binoculars tight, watching it move, slow and deliberate. Then, all at once, the reflection I had seen when the beam hit it disappeared. The shape stayed, but the little flashes of light stopped. It was as if the thing had absorbed the beam instead of reflecting it. The air felt heavier, and I realized my hands were trembling. I told myself I was tired. I was alone. The fog and darkness and long hours could play tricks, but I couldn't shake the outline. It was enormous, larger than any ship I'd ever seen, and it was hovering. It didn't belong in the water. It didn't belong anywhere. I tried the binoculars again, focusing on edges, trying to make out details. Nothing. Just a dark, hulking mass floating silently. Then it shifted. Not fast, but just enough. And for a second, I swear, I could see it tilt slightly, almost like it was observing me. I blinked, and it straightened. My mind raced. I was alone. No one else would see this. The idea made my skin crawl. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually, I got cold, and the wind started to bite. I told myself to leave, to go back inside and lock the door, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The shape had moved closer again, still silent, still hovering. Finally, I did step back, dragging myself inside. I closed the door, checked the locks, and kept the binoculars trained through the window. By the time dawn started to lighten the sky, the fog had thinned. I went out onto the balcony. The shape was gone. The water looked normal. The horizon looked normal. Even the hum had vanished. I walked down to the dock. No disturbance in the water. No wreckage, no floating debris, nothing. The tide was calm, the fog gone, the sea ordinary again. I called the Coast Guard later in the morning, claiming a false alarm, just a fishing buoy or something. I never mentioned it to anyone else. Not Clara, not the neighbor keepers. I told myself I had imagined it, even though I couldn't explain the shadows, the reflection, or the hum. The experience stayed with me. I'd catch myself staring out over the water at night, expecting to see it again, but it never returned. Some nights, I still wake to the memory of that dark shape hovering over the waves, silent and immense, and I wonder if anyone else could have seen it. But the whole time, I knew I was alone in knowing it was there. I never figured it out. Whatever it was, it didn't belong to any ship, any plane, any storm. Just something different. Out there, over the water, waiting for no one in particular. I was running the midnight shift along Highway 66 in the summer of 1953, my patrol car humming across the desert like it was part of the quiet itself. I'd been alone for hours, just the hum of the engine and the occasional coyote howling far off. It was the kind of night where the stars seemed closer, brighter than usual, spread across the black sky in a way that made the desert feel smaller somehow. I was about halfway between Kingman and Seligman when I spotted a car pulled over on the shoulder. Headlights off, engine probably dead, sitting there like it had been abandoned. I pulled up slowly, flashing my lights briefly. The car was a 1950 Plymouth, older model, dark green. I stepped out into the warm sand, the heat of the asphalt sticking to my shoes, and started walking toward the driver's side. I could see a man inside, his hands on the wheel, staring straight up at the sky. Not moving, not blinking, just staring. I called out, "Everything all right, sir?" But he didn't respond. The first thing that got me was how still he was. I've seen people freeze in shock before, but this was something different. His eyes were fixed upward, and it wasn't the way someone squints at a streetlight or the glare off the dashboard. I followed his gaze, and that's when I noticed it. The stars weren't just bright. They were shifting. Not like clouds moving across the sky, but like they were revolving slowly around some invisible center above the car. I blinked, shook my head. Maybe I'd been driving too long. Maybe the heat was playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, they were still moving. I tapped on the driver's window. He jumped slightly, but only his shoulders moved. His face stayed turned up, eyes wide. I called again. "Sir, I need you to step out of the car." Nothing. The engine was dead, and I could hear the faint wind rattling the antenna. No crickets, no night birds, just a quiet hum from the desert itself. I circled to the passenger side, thinking maybe he was hurt or passed out. The interior looked normal, nothing spilled, no one else inside. Then I noticed something else. The air around the car seemed different. I can't describe it any other way. It was like the air itself was thicker, heavier, almost vibrating. I reached out and touched the door handle. It was warm but not hot, like it had been sitting in the sun too long, which made sense. And yet, it didn't feel quite real. I stepped back and squinted at the sky again. The stars were definitely moving. In circles. Not fast, not like a spinning carousel, but deliberate, like someone had taken a brush and slowly rotated it around a central point. I tried to shake it off. "I'm seeing things," I muttered. I even rubbed my eyes, pacing back and forth. But when I looked again, the pattern hadn't changed. I opened the door slowly, keeping my hand near my service revolver, just in case. The man didn't react. I leaned in and touched his shoulder. He was cold, unnaturally cold. "Sir?" I whispered, almost expecting him to snap out of it, but his eyes stayed glued to the ceiling of the sky, and I could swear I saw them reflecting something white, glowing faintly. Not a star. I stepped back, heart thumping. My mind started spinning through possibilities. Heat stroke, gas inhalation, something in the car. But there was no smell, nothing out of place. I glanced around, felt the wind stir my hair, The desert was empty, no trucks, no cars, no animals, just the quiet, the moving stars, and him. Then, slowly, I noticed the headlights of the car weren't pointing straight ahead anymore. They were angled slightly toward the sky. Not fully, just a tilt. Like the car itself was trying to look up at the same thing the man was. My pulse quickened. I tried to call for backup on the radio, but the static was worse than usual, buzzing and cutting out. I fiddled with the knobs, checked the frequency, but nothing came through. Just more static. I realized I couldn't just leave him there, so I reached in, tried to put the car in neutral. It was locked, but he hadn't moved a muscle. I opened the door wider and tried to lift his hands off the wheel. That's when I noticed his pupils weren't normal. They were huge, nearly the whole eye, dark and glistening. I jerked back, took a step, then froze. The stars above had started to spiral more distinctly, a slow, steady rotation. It was mesmerizing and terrifying at the same time. I don't know how long I stood there, a minute, 10, maybe more. Time felt weird, stretched. Then, almost imperceptibly, the man blinked. Slowly, just once, and then he slumped forward. I grabbed his arms, shook him. "Hey, wake up!" he gasped, looked around like he'd just woken from a dream, confused, sweaty. I thought I saw something," he said, voice trembling. I asked what he meant, and he just shook his head. "Stars, moving, like they were alive." I nodded, not telling him what I'd seen. I didn't want him thinking I was crazy. I helped him start the car. The engine turned over, sputtered, then ran. He drove off slowly, and I followed a few feet behind until the pavement ended, and he merged onto the main highway. I stayed a while longer, staring at the spot where the car had been. The stars looked normal now, just twinkling in the black sky. No spiral, no glow, just normal. I got back into my patrol car, started the engine, and kept driving east, trying to keep my mind busy. But the image of the man's eyes and the movement in the stars stayed with me. The next morning, I went back to the spot during my day shift. Nothing. Tire tracks from last night, sure, but no sign anything had been strange. The desert sand had shifted a little with the wind, erasing some of the tracks. I asked around in Kingman and Seligman. No one else had reported anything odd. The man? I never saw him again. He wasn't listed in any hospital logs or police records. I didn't tell anyone in detail. Not at the station, not my friends. You'd be called a fool, or worse, a liar. I've told a few people now, years later, and they just nod politely, thinking I'm joking. But I remember that night exactly. The heat, the stillness, the way the air felt heavy, the man in the Plymouth, frozen and staring, and the stars, moving in circles, slow and deliberate, above us. I don't know what it was, I don't know why it happened, but I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone in feeling something there in the desert that night. Something that made the air hum, made time stretch, and left a man staring up at the sky in fear and awe. I drive that stretch of Highway 66 occasionally, usually during the day, sometimes at night if work calls me out. I've never seen it again, and I hope I never do. But every time I look up at the stars, there's a part of me that still checks to see if they've started moving. It's the kind of thing that doesn't leave you, no matter how much you want it to. I was driving my family home that night, a narrow stretch of road just outside of Plainfield, New Hampshire. My wife, Claire, was in the passenger seat, and the kids, Timmy and Sally, were in the back, half asleep. The air was cold, and a thin fog had settled over the pines that bordered the road, making the beams from our headlights dull and yellowish. I'd been on this route plenty of times, but that night, everything felt different. Slower, somehow, like the fog was thickening around us more than it should have. I had just rounded a bend when I saw them, two bright points of light in the distance, perfectly aligned, coming straight at us. At first, I thought it was a car, but something about it didn't feel right. The lights didn't waver like headlights usually do. They stayed exactly level with each other. My first instinct was to slow down and pull over to the side of the road, and I heard Claire mutter, "Someone's coming," in that low, nervous voice she sometimes gets. The lights got closer, and I realized there was no sound, no engine, no tires crunching on the gravel shoulder, nothing. Just those two spots of brightness, steady, staring at us like eyes. I slowed all the way down and eased our Plymouth over to the side. The kids stirred a little, and Timmy asked if we were going to stop for someone. I told him yes, just a minute. Then the weird part happened. The lights lifted. Not like a car going over a hill, but literally rose from the road, drifting upwards silently, almost lazily, like they were buoyant or floating on some invisible current. Claire gasped, and I could hear her clutching her coat tighter around her shoulders. Timmy and Sally were both sitting up now, wide-eyed. The lights went higher, past the tops of the trees, and then drifted slowly toward the east, disappearing into the thicker darkness of the forest beyond. I sat there a moment, unsure if I had imagined it. My hand was still on the gear shift, and my foot was frozen over the brake. The fog swirled around the car in a way that made it hard to tell which way was up. Claire finally said, "Did you see that?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. We drove on, slower this time, the kids asking if it was a plane or a helicopter. I told them I didn't know, but I didn't say anything about the lights floating. There was no engine noise, no evidence of anything mechanical. Just 2 points of light, moving like they weren't bound by gravity. About 15 minutes later, as we approached the old bridge over Cedar Brook, I thought I saw something in the trees to our left. A movement that didn't match the natural sway of the branches. I blinked, trying to focus, and it seemed like there was a figure, maybe 4 feet tall, standing perfectly still. I could only catch glimpses between the trees, but I felt it watching us. My grip tightened on the wheel. "Dad?" Sally whispered from the back. "Why is it dark over there?" "Nothing, honey," I said, though my voice sounded hollow to me. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was moving with us just out of sight. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the fog seemed heavier, pressing against the car windows like it was alive. Occasionally, I'd catch a flicker of light out of the corner of my eye, small glimmers, too quick to be fireflies, too bright for stars. I looked for animals on the road, but there was nothing. No deer, no rabbits, no raccoon. Just fog, dark trees, and that unsettling feeling of being observed. By the time we got to the edge of town, the fog thinned and the lights of the houses looked ordinary. The kids had quieted down, Claire was pale but trying to stay calm, and I was just glad to see street lamps again. I parked in front of our house and didn't move for a while, just staring at the black line of the road disappearing into the trees. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the sound of that road in my head, the way the fog had sounded against the car, and the faint echo of something lifting silently. I went back outside around midnight to check the road. Nothing. Just the empty road, some ice glinting under the moon, and the occasional owl calling from the pines. No tracks, no footprints, nothing to explain what I'd seen. The next day, I went back to the stretch where we'd pulled over. There were tire marks from our Plymouth and the faint impression of our car's wheels on the gravel, but no sign that any other vehicle had passed through. Not a mark, not a smudge, nothing at all. I walked along the roadside for nearly a mile, checking for footprints or broken branches. The trees were all untouched. I asked a neighbor if they'd seen anything odd the night before. They hadn't. No one reported strange lights or missing time. I wondered if I had made it up, but I knew I hadn't. Claire had seen it too, and she wasn't the type to jump at shadows. A week later, I was driving past the same road, trying to act normal, and I felt a tug of dread in the pit of my stomach. The fog had rolled back in that evening, heavier than I remembered. I slowed down, and for a moment I thought I saw something moving just at the edge of the trees again, a shimmer, like a reflection or a ripple. My heart started pounding, but when I looked directly, nothing was there. I still don't know what it was. 2 lights, rising off the ground, silently, drifting into the sky, and that fleeting glimpse of movement in the trees. I've gone back to that road plenty of times, during the day, at night, in clear weather, in fog, but it hasn't happened again. Still, every time I pass that stretch, I feel like someone or something is watching, just out of reach. Some people think I made it up, or that it was a trick of fog and headlights, but I know what I saw. The weirdest part is that it wasn't threatening. There was no roar, no danger, no pain, just presence, moving in ways it shouldn't. I can't explain it, and that's what keeps me uneasy. Claire says I shouldn't dwell on it, that our family is safe and the lights probably had a simple explanation. Maybe. But the image of those 2 lights, lifting off the ground and gliding away without sound, stays with me. Sometimes at night, when the wind is low and the fog presses against the window, I imagine them rising again, just beyond the pines, waiting. I tell the story like this because it's real. Nothing has come after us, nothing followed the car, nothing tried to touch us. But there's a strange emptiness in that part of the road, a quiet that doesn't belong. And I know, if the fog rolls in again, I'll see it too. The kids never mentioned it again. Claire never wanted to drive that road at night for a while. I understand why. And I understand that some things, no matter how clearly you see them, don't fit with the world as you know it. You just have to accept that and keep driving. That's what we did. I was working the night shift at the Sinclair station out by Route 66 in 1953. It was the kind of stretch where the highway barely had shoulders, and the desert seemed to stretch on forever. The wind had picked up that evening, kicking up dust and rattling the pump canopy. It wasn't busy. I'd had maybe 2 cars in the last hour, both just passing through, but then a car pulled in that made me stop for a second. It was an older Packard, dark blue, with what looked like a fresh coat of paint. Nothing really remarkable about it at first, except the way it glided to a stop. Quiet, almost too quiet. I was wiping down the counter when the driver rolled down the window. He had a pale, almost colorless face, and his eyes were steady, staring straight at me without blinking. "Evening?" he said. His voice was flat, calm, almost mechanical. "Do the crafts still land nearby?" I paused, caught off guard. I mean, I was used to weird questions out here. Folks were always asking about meteor sightings or the militaries, but crafts? That threw me. I nodded slowly, unsure what to say. "Sometimes," I muttered, keeping my voice neutral. He didn't smile or nod. He just waited, silent, as if the answer satisfied him without needing confirmation. I went to start pumping his gas. I remember glancing at the car again. It had this shine, but the metal didn't quite reflect light the way other cars did, like it absorbed it. The desert lights, the gas pumps, even the stars overhead looked dull around it. When I looked back at him to ask if he needed anything else, the license plate caught my eye. I could swear it had had numbers when he pulled in, but now it was blank. No letters, no numbers, just the metal backing. I blinked, looked twice. He was watching me, still quiet, waiting, and the wind howled between us. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a reflection from the canopy lights. I asked, "Need anything inside?" My voice sounded sharper than I intended. "Just directions," he said. He pointed vaguely down the highway, to the place where they appear. I nodded again, keeping my hands on the counter. Something about him made me hesitate. Most people who asked questions like that were nervous, almost embarrassed. Not him. He spoke like he had every right to know, like it was fact. The wind kicked up more sand, hitting the windshield and bouncing around the lot. I noticed the desert behind the station was unusually still. Usually you'd hear coyotes, wind in the rocks, even a car on the distant highway. That night there was silence, heavy and thick. I could hear the gas dripping into the tank. That was it. He didn't move, just sat there, staring. I had to force myself to step closer to try and get a better look at the plate. Nothing. Just bare metal. My palms started feeling clammy. I wanted to ask him what the hell he was doing out here, but the words stuck in my throat. The Packard's engine ticked quietly as it cooled. I realized I hadn't smelled gasoline from it the way I usually did with cars. No exhaust, not even that faint oily scent from the motor. I blinked and glanced at the hood again. The paint shimmered strangely, almost like it was wet, but it wasn't. "Why are you here?" I asked finally, my voice lower, almost uncertain. He tilted his head. "To see if anyone remembers," I frowned. "Remembers what?" He didn't answer. He just sat, hands on the wheel, pale face unwavering. I felt that tension where your stomach tightens and your throat goes dry. I could almost hear my own heartbeat over the quiet desert. I looked back at the pump, pretending to check the meter, trying to act normal. When I looked again, the car seemed different. Not moved, but different. The shadows around it weren't quite right. It sat there, but the shape almost blurred at the edges, like it didn't belong. "I'd better get going," he said finally, his voice still calm. He started the car, and it rolled forward slowly. I was watching, still frozen near the counter, when he drove past the pumps. Then it happened. The car didn't just drive down the road, it rose. Not like it jumped or bounced, it lifted smoothly, silently, and hovered maybe 20 feet above the asphalt. The headlights, which had been steady and dull, now glowed softly against the desert night. The metal of the car caught a little starlight, but it didn't reflect like normal. It drifted straight up, then slowly arced over the station and the highway until it was just a faint speck among the stars. I don't know how long I stood there. I couldn't think straight, couldn't believe what I'd seen. When I finally blinked, the desert was empty. The wind had returned, rattling the canopy, shaking loose dust from the roof of the station. The Packard was gone. I tried calling the local deputy the next day, but he laughed me off. Said I probably had a little too much coffee, that it was just a car in the wind. Even when I asked some regular truckers who'd passed the station, no one remembered anything unusual. Just me. For weeks, I kept scanning that stretch of road at night. Sometimes I thought I'd see a light in the distance, moving just differently than any plane or car should, but nothing like that car again. The desert seemed normal, except in my memory. I can't explain it. I can't explain the license plate, the way the car hovered, the quiet calm of that man, or the way the air felt heavier, like it was holding its breath while he was there. I never saw him again. Never heard anyone else talk about it. I kept the station for another year before selling it. Every so often, when I drive down that stretch of Route 66, I glance up at the stars, half expecting to see headlights drifting among them. Nothing has ever appeared again, at least not like that. But I can't shake the memory, and sometimes at night, when the wind kicks up dust across the pumps, I swear I feel that same quiet, measured gaze watching me. And the thing is, I'd recognize that flat, calm voice anywhere. I was driving back from a job in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1952 along Highway 77, and the night was clear, nothing but moonlight on the blacktop. I'd been on the road since mid-afternoon, my old Chevy humming along like it always did, and I was just thinking about grabbing a bite at a diner when I saw it. This billboard off to the side of the road, right where the cornfield started to thin. It looked brand new, bright and almost garish under the moonlight. It had this advertisement for a drink called Salora's Nectar or something like that. I remember it so clearly because I figured it had to be a new soda, a competitor to some of the big names. The letters were shiny, almost like enamel, and there was a picture of a tall glass with what looked like fruit floating inside it. I slowed down, thinking maybe I'd stop next time and try it, but there wasn't a stand or a store or anything. Just the billboard, standing alone in the dark like it had sprung up overnight. I told my buddy George about it the next morning when I called from a gas station. He laughed and said I must have been tired seeing things. But when I drove back the following Saturday, the billboard was gone. Not knocked down, not vandalized, just gone. I slowed the car, squinting down the road, but the cornfields were empty, the fence posts old and weathered. I asked the station attendant in Waverly if he knew anything about a new soda ad out there. He frowned and shook his head. "Never heard of it," he said. "Haven't seen any new billboards either. You sure you weren't imagining it?" I was sure. I knew exactly where it had been. The feeling wasn't just confusion. It was something heavier, like being caught off guard by something that shouldn't have been there in the first place. The next week, I decided to go back during the day, thinking maybe I'd misremembered the location. The road looked the same. Everything looked normal. I stopped at a small farm nearby to ask if anyone had seen a billboard, but the farmer just raised his eyebrows and said no. He hadn't noticed anything unusual. Not a new sign, not a strange advertisement, nothing. And I swear, every detail I remembered, the colors, the way the light hit it, the glass of fruit, it was like it had been real, right there, waiting for me. A few nights later, I took a different route back to Lincoln, just to see if maybe I was misremembering the road, and I noticed something strange. There were these little lights in the distance, hovering, almost like fireflies, but too high and too steady for bugs. I slowed down, trying to get a better look. They didn't move like airplanes or cars, just stayed there, pulsing softly. I drove closer, but the closer I got, the more they seemed to fade, until they were gone entirely. that leaving nothing but the dark fields. I told George about it, and he got that same laugh, that dismissive, "you've been driving too much" thing. But I kept thinking about the billboard. It didn't fit. If someone had put it up as a joke, why remove it so cleanly? And the lights, well, maybe I was seeing things again, but it felt connected somehow, like the two events were different sides of the same impossible moment. A week after that, I was heading back home late at night. The roads were quiet, the wind low. I passed by the area where I'd seen the billboard the first time, and I could swear I saw something flicker just off the road where the cornfield started. It was nothing solid, more a blur, like a shadow of the billboard, but I could see the shape of that tall glass in it, the fruit inside catching the moonlight. I slammed on the brakes and stopped. There was nothing there, just the dark, empty fields. I kept driving, my heart thumping, trying to convince myself I'd just been tired, that the long stretches of highway and the monotony of the corn had messed with my eyes. But then I noticed the same little hovering lights from before, only closer this time, right over the fields. They didn't move quickly or erratically, just floated, almost as if they were watching me. I blinked, and one of them vanished. Then another. By the time I was past that stretch, all of them were gone. I told my wife about it when I got home. She listened politely, but she didn't ask questions. She just said I'd been driving a lot, that I needed rest. I agreed. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe my mind had made a billboard out of nothing. But then came the strangest part. A couple of nights later, I was at a small diner outside Lincoln, having coffee. The waitress brought it over and set it down, and I noticed her eyes flick toward the window, then back at me. "Did you see it?" she asked quietly. I frowned. "See what?" She hesitated, like she wasn't sure if she should say it. "Out there, over the fields, lights. People have been talking, been seeing them all week." I didn't tell her about the billboard, didn't want to sound even more insane. I just nodded, said I'd probably been driving too much. But inside, I knew she'd seen something too. A few nights after that, I went back out, just to drive the highway again. I couldn't shake it, the feeling that something was off. The road was empty, the air still. I passed the place where the billboard had been, and I swore I saw a faint glow, like the sign itself was burning quietly, almost transparent, over the corn. I blinked, and it was gone. I kept looking over the next few weeks. Every time I drove past that stretch of highway, I'd catch glimpses of lights, faint, hovering, always fleeting. Sometimes they were close to the ground, sometimes high in the sky. Once, I thought I saw the outline of the billboard again, just for a second, before it vanished completely. I've never been able to explain it. People I told about the lights laughed or ignored me. The billboard, well, no one recalls it, not even people who live right along the road. I never found anyone who remembered Solora's Nectar, and the company doesn't exist. Years later, driving that highway again, I passed the old spot. Cornfields on both sides, nothing out of place. The road was quiet, the night clear, and for a moment I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I caught a flash of light, like a reflection off glass, hovering above the field, and I pressed the accelerator a little harder, staring straight ahead until I was past it. I don't know what it was. I don't know why it showed itself to me like that, or why the billboard appeared and disappeared. I only know the feeling it left, this sense that the world isn't quite as solid as it looks, that sometimes things slip through, just for a moment, and you see them, whether you understand them or not. After that night, I stopped looking for explanations. I just kept driving, watching, and hoping it didn't find a reason to follow me home. I was working at a logging camp up near the Cascades in 1950, along with 4 other men. We'd been hauling firs and pines for weeks, living in those rough canvas tents that leak if the wind picks up too much. I was Joe Mallory, just a kid from Portland looking for steady work, and the other men, Frank, Bill, Amos, and Henry, had been around the mountains longer than I had been alive. Nights there were quiet in a way that presses against you. The wind through the trees, the scrape of logs against one another, and nothing else. We got used to the quiet, but it made any strange sounds seem enormous. It started one evening when I went to check the line of cut timber along the far edge of camp. I noticed something sitting on one of the stumps near the clearing where we stacked the logs. At first, I thought it was one of the men playing a joke. The figure didn't move as I walked closer, but it was clearly a man. Tall, unnaturally so, maybe 7 feet, and pale, almost the color of fresh birch bark. His shoulders were stiff, and he didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the wind rustling the leaves or the faint cry of an owl. He just sat there. "Evening," I said cautiously. He didn't respond. I called out again. Still nothing. I took a few steps closer, and then he spoke. His voice was flat, precise, like a schoolmaster reading from a lesson. "The tests are finished." That froze me. Not just because it was strange, but because it sounded exactly like a line from some radio play or textbook, nothing like anyone around camp. I tried to reply, "Tests? What are you talking about?" But he didn't answer. He just stared straight ahead, not at me, not anywhere. I went back to the tents and told the other men. Frank laughed. "Kids seeing things. Go get some sleep." But Bill, who had been in these woods longer than anyone, frowned. "Let's go see," he said. We grabbed lanterns and cautiously made our way back. When we got there, the stump was empty. No one. We all looked around the clearing, our lanterns casting wide circles of light over the mud and leaves. Nothing. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. Even in the soft mud along the path leading into the clearing, there wasn't a single print. We all stood there, mouths open, and finally Amos said, "Well, maybe it was a trick of the light." I didn't think so. I knew what I'd seen. The next night it returned, same stump, same posture, same expressionless stare. I didn't call out this time, I just watched from a distance. The others were skeptical, though Henry did glance nervously over his shoulder a few times. Then the figure spoke again, same monotone. "Tests are finished." Bill, getting impatient, stepped closer. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure turned its head slightly, just enough that you could tell it was aware of us. I said nothing else. We waited tense, the air thick with mist rolling off the hills. Then it stood, tall, rigid. It turned toward the woods, walked a few steps, and disappeared into the shadows. I followed the next morning, thinking we could track it, but nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing at all that would indicate a path through the soft mud. It was as if it had been lifted from the ground. The men began talking in low voices about it. Some thought it was a deserter from the city, a hobo maybe. But none of us had ever seen anyone like that, and no train or road came near these woods for miles. After that, the figure started appearing at different times. Sometimes late at night, just sitting there on the stump, other times at dusk, watching from the edge of the clearing. Always the same calm, quiet demeanor. No one tried to follow it anymore. It was unsettling, the way it moved and spoke without feeling. One afternoon, I was out checking a new line of logs when I saw it standing by the creek that ran through the camp. I froze because it was looking directly at me, perfectly still. I lifted my hat and waved slowly. It didn't move. Then it spoke again, softer this time, almost conversational. "Tests are finished." That was it. Then it stepped into the water, and nothing. No splash. The ripples spread out as if something had touched the surface, but there was no sound of footsteps, no wet footprints leading into the creek. It vanished. That night, Frank admitted he had seen it too. Not like I had, but a shadowy outline near the tent, speaking the same words, leaving nothing behind. We all started sleeping in shifts, keeping lanterns by the door. The wind felt heavier, the woods closer, like they were pressing down on the tents. The strange thing is, after a few nights, it stopped appearing as often. Then one night, during a heavy fog, we saw a light moving through the tree line. Not a lantern, not a campfire, just a pale glow bobbing slowly. We thought maybe it was the figure, but it moved too strangely, gliding rather than walking. Frank swore it disappeared behind a tree, but when we ran over, there was nothing. No footprints, no scuffed leaves, no hint anyone had been there. I started keeping a notebook. Every time it appeared, I'd write down the time, weather, anything unusual. Over a few weeks, I noticed the pattern. It was never around when the fog was thick, and it seemed to appear more during still nights when the air smelled of wet pine and the creek ran quietly. The last night we saw it, I had been alone. I was stacking firewood, and the mist rolled in quickly from the hills. I heard the voice first, soft and clear. "Tests are finished." I spun around, expecting to see it on the stump, but it was standing behind me, just a few feet. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel the weight of it there, calm, watching. I whispered, "What are you testing?" No answer. Then, as I blinked, it was gone. Nothing but fog, mud, and the soft sound of the creek. The next morning, the other men found me staring at the stump, lantern in hand, completely silent. They asked if I'd seen it again. I nodded. Bill laughed nervously and said, "Well, if it's done with its tests, maybe it won't bother us anymore." Nobody said anything else. I left the camp a week later. By then, the other men had started to whisper about it, and there was tension I hadn't noticed before. We all went our separate ways, and none of us ever saw the figure again. I thought about writing a report for the logging company, but I couldn't. They'd have thought I was crazy, and honestly, I wasn't sure I understood it myself. Even now, decades later, I remember the cold calm in its voice, the way it moved without leaving a mark, and the endless stillness it carried. I never tried to find out what it was. Some things in those woods just aren't meant to be understood. It doesn't make sense. Tall, pale, speaking about tests that didn't seem to involve us, vanishing without a trace. But it wasn't dangerous. Never was. But it left a quiet unease that followed me long after the mountains disappeared behind the road. Sometimes I swear I can still hear the words, low and even, floating through the mist. Tests are finished. I never went back. I was driving the 715 out of Millersville, a little bus route that runs between the county seat and the farms scattered across the outskirts. It was 1954, and the mornings could get foggy along the back roads, the kind of fog that makes your headlights barely reach the next fence post. That day started like any other, chilly, the kind of damp that seeps into your coat if you leave it hanging in the back. I had my thermos of coffee, a pack of cigarettes, and a route I could run in my sleep. I pulled up to the small stop just past Harper's Hollow, a single wooden sign nailed crooked to a telephone pole. I was the only vehicle for miles, and I always kept an eye out for the occasional farmer or school kid waiting. That morning, I saw them. 3 figures standing there, bundled up in coats that looked heavy and old-fashioned. One was a man with a cap pulled low, one woman with her scarf wrapped tight, and a boy no older than 10. They looked normal enough, but something about their posture, the way they were just standing there in the fog, made me hesitate a second. "Morning," I called as I pulled the bus to a stop. They waved, and I opened the doors. The man and woman climbed in, the boy following. They paid in change, but I remember being struck by how quiet they were. No small talk, no hello beyond the nods and murmurs, just the sound of their coats brushing against the seats as they found a road toward the middle. The fog was heavier now, crawling across the road like it had a mind of its own. I put the bus in gear and kept my eyes forward, but I could feel them behind me. Not in a threatening way, more like a weight pressing in, the kind you feel when someone's watching too closely. I glanced in the mirror. They weren't looking at me, not really, just staring straight ahead, and their eyes had a kind of dull reflection that didn't quite match the dim morning light. As I passed the Hollow Creek Bridge, I noticed something odd. The water underneath was still, almost unnaturally so. I'd driven this route hundreds of times, and the creek always rippled, even with the fog. But this morning, it looked like glass. I shook it off. Maybe it was the fog, maybe just the angle of the sun or the way the water caught the pale light. The rest of the ride was uneventful until I hit the second stop, an old wooden platform at the edge of a small cluster of farms. I pulled the bus over, letting the brake hiss, and called out, "Next stop, Millersville Station." I looked back to check on my passengers, and the row was empty. At first, I thought maybe they'd gotten off while I was turning the wheel or checking my mirrors, but I was the only one who'd been in the driver's seat. There was no sound of feet on the boards, no rustle of coats, nothing. I stepped down and looked around the platform. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt, not even the kind of faint drag marks a coat might leave. I checked the bus twice more, inside and out. Nothing. The seats were as empty as they'd been before I picked them up. The fog had thinned slightly, but the morning light revealed nothing unusual, just the same rows of benches and the chipped paint on the platform. I was sure I hadn't imagined it. I could still feel the weight of them in the bus, like a cold draft clinging to the seats, and the dull reflection of their eyes that wouldn't leave my mind. I drove on, slow, my hands tight on the wheel. The road wound through farmland, and the barns and fences looked normal. But the stillness was strange. No crows, no dogs barking, no wind rustling the corn stalks, just the engine of the bus and the occasional groan of the suspension. A few miles out, I noticed something else. There was a light off to the side, behind a line of trees. Not a lamp, not the kind of glow from a farmhouse, but a soft, silvery shimmer. I slowed down, squinting, but the fog blurred it in and out. For a moment, I thought it might be the reflection of my own headlights, but it didn't move the way a reflection would. It stayed just above the ground, hovering like it had been waiting for me. Then, as I blinked, it was gone. I chalked it up to my nerves. Morning fog plays tricks, and I'd been on this route for years, enough to know that the mind can make shapes out of nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched the whole time. When I reached Millersville Station, I let the bus roll to a stop and killed the engine. The station was quiet, the benches empty. I got out, stretched, and walked around the bus, checking for passengers. Nothing. Not a single trace. I asked the ticket clerk, old man Reed, if he'd seen anyone on my bus this morning. He frowned, looked me over, and shook his head. "You sure, Frank? Not a soul?" I nodded, though I didn't understand it myself. I told him about the stop at Harper's Hollow, the 3 passengers. He didn't laugh, didn't joke, just gave me a long look, the kind you give someone who's seen something you can't quite explain. "Funny," he said finally. "I've been working here 10 years. Never heard anyone come from that direction this early. Roads out there hardly see a soul before 7. I drove home after that, feeling the emptiness of the roads more than usual. The fog had burned off by then, leaving a pale sun and the normal morning sounds of town waking up. But in the back of my mind, I kept seeing them. The man's low cap, the woman's scarf wrapped tight, the boy staring ahead without moving, and that soft silver shimmer behind the trees, as if it had been following at a distance the whole ride. I tried to tell myself I'd been tired, my mind playing tricks, but the memory of their quiet, the way the bus had felt weighted in their presence, didn't fade. I checked the Harper's Hollow stop a few days later, hoping to find a clue, a footprint, a scrap of coat left behind. Nothing. Just the fog rolling across the fields and the old wooden sign, crooked as ever. After that, I stuck to my routine, drove the same route, and nothing like it ever happened again. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in and the morning is still and the road seems too quiet, I swear I can see a shape at the edge of the trees, faint and silver, watching, waiting. And for a moment I wonder if I should turn the bus around, go back to that empty stop, just to see if it was all real, or if I'm the only one who remembers at all. It never came close, never made a sound. But the memory of that ride, the way the seats had felt heavier, the emptiness where they should have been, it sticks with me more than anything else I've seen on that road. Even after all these years, I still check the mirrors a little longer than I should, just in case. I woke up to the first gray light seeping through the curtains of the sheriff's office, the kind of dawn that makes everything look softer but colder. The office smelled faintly of coffee and sawdust from the floors I'd scrubbed the night before. I rubbed my eyes and noticed the quiet, too quiet for a town that usually had at least one early riser heading to the diner or the depot. That's when I saw them. There was a line of people on the courthouse steps, standing shoulder to shoulder, all facing the same direction, just outside my window. I froze for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The courthouse sits at the end of the main street in Millersville, a place that barely had 100 folks living in it. And I'd walked past that courthouse 100 times. I knew everyone in town by sight, at least. I didn't recognize everyone in that line. I grabbed my hat and coat and stepped out, my boots crunching on frost-hardened gravel. They didn't move or look at me. They just stood there, perfectly still. The air felt heavier than usual, like it had weight pressing down on my shoulders. I called out, "Morning, folks. Everything all right?" No answer. I walked closer, trying to figure out what was going on. My heart started to pound when I noticed the way they were all positioned. Feet perfectly straight, hands at their sides, heads tilted slightly forward. There wasn't a hint of breath in the cold air around them, no clouds from their mouths. Some of them I recognized. Mrs. Hensley from the bakery, old Tom Miller who ran the hardware store, even young Ricky Langley, but others I swore I'd never seen before. "Hey," I said again, a little louder this time. I moved toward the first person, a woman in a blue coat. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. I reached out and tapped her shoulder, and then she just started walking. Not fast, not running, just walking. And everyone else followed the same motion at the exact same pace, in unison. I stepped back, unsure if I was seeing things. They went down the courthouse steps together, still silent, still facing that same direction, and then disappeared into the street, scattering into the town like nothing had happened. I rubbed my eyes, shook my head, thinking maybe I was dreaming. But the frost on the steps had footprints now pressed deep into the stone, like matching the pattern of their steps. And the silence lingered. I wandered down Main Street, trying to find someone, anyone, awake and moving like normal. The diner had its door open, steam curling from the coffee urns, but no one was inside. I peeked into the bakery, same thing. The streets were empty, except for the line of people now somewhere in the distance. Their movement had a weird rhythm, like a march but softer, slower, and not aggressive. Just controlled. By the time I got to the post office, the sun was a little higher and a few people had started appearing. Early farmers heading out with their wagons, a couple of kids on their way to the schoolhouse. I called out to them, trying to see if anyone else had noticed the line, but no one looked like they had. They acted normal, like the courthouse line had never existed. I went back toward the courthouse, hoping maybe I'd misunderstood, that I'd hallucinated the whole thing. But the frost was still pressed into the steps where they'd walked. The imprint was faint, almost like it was fading as the day warmed, but it was there. I knelt down, running my gloved fingers over the shapes, counting the footprints. Every person in that line left exactly the same size and shape of footprints. Every step measured the same. I got up quickly, feeling that weight again, the same pressing sense I felt when I first saw them. Later, I tried talking to the folks who lived closest to the courthouse. Mrs. Hensley, who I know always wakes up before the sun, said she'd slept through it, though she didn't sound convinced. Old Tom Miller swore he was in his shed feeding chickens and hadn't left all morning, but when I asked him exactly when, his timeline seemed fuzzy. Every story I heard was a little off, like memories had been stitched over something. I kept walking around town, trying to make sense of it. I didn't see the line again, but I started noticing little things that didn't make sense. A lantern on Mrs. Hensley's porch had been moved, though she swore it hadn't been. A shovel in the hardware store yard was now leaning against the fence in a different spot. No one claimed to have moved anything. The whole morning felt stretched, like it had extra minutes I couldn't account for. By mid-afternoon, everything had settled into what looked like normalcy. People were back in the diner, kids were laughing near the schoolhouse, and the town was humming with the usual sounds. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd glance down a side street and see a shadow, or someone standing perfectly still at the edge of the alleyway, and when I looked closer, it wasn't anyone I recognized. They'd vanish when I approached, leaving the streets empty again. That evening, I sat in my office, trying to write down everything I'd seen. I kept stopping because I wasn't sure I was remembering it correctly. I couldn't explain the line on the courthouse steps, couldn't explain why everyone who had been in it seemed different. Even those I knew well. Something about them felt distant, like they weren't entirely themselves. Around dusk, I went outside to check the streets one last time. The town looked normal in the low light, lanterns glowing warmly from porches, smoke curling from chimneys. I walked past the courthouse and the frost prints were gone, replaced by shadows stretching long in the twilight. I paused at the top of the steps, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw figures forming a line again, just at the edge of my vision, silent and still, looking in the same direction. I blinked and they were gone. I never saw the line again. People went about their lives like nothing happened. But I never stopped noticing little things, objects out of place, shadows that didn't belong, that sense of rhythm in the air, like someone had stepped through the town and everyone followed without even realizing it. I tried telling a few folks what I'd seen, but most just laughed, thought I was joking or imagining things. A couple looked at me sideways, worried maybe I'd lost my grip on things. I stopped mentioning it after that. Some nights, when the wind comes down from the hills and rattles the windows, I see the courthouse steps in my mind, lined with those silent people, all facing the same way. I can still hear the faint echo of their footsteps marching together, soft against the stone. And even now, years later, I don't know what it was or why it happened, but I know it wasn't a dream. I made it home that morning, the town carried on, and yet I can't shake the feeling that something passed through Millersville and left everyone just a little different. It wasn't violent, it wasn't loud, it was just there, a quiet, orderly intrusion that didn't belong. And I can't explain any of it. I was driving down Route 66 in 1953, heading west toward Oklahoma City. It was late afternoon, sun low but still hot, and the highway was almost empty, except for the occasional pickup or truck. I had my sales bag in the passenger seat, full of catalogs and samples, and a thermos of coffee I kept sipping from every so often. It was the kind of day where you could almost feel the asphalt radiating, and everything around you seemed washed out in heat and dust. I noticed the first billboard about 20 miles out of Tulsa. It was one of those big roadside ones, painted bright with a car advertisement. Nothing fancy, just a gleaming sedan and some bold letters. What caught my eye was the lights above it. They weren't bright, just little bulbs strung across the top. But they blinked in a pattern, 3 quick flashes, then 3 long ones, then 3 quick again. I laughed to myself. Maybe some kid wiring a timer on a whim, I thought. I drove past, checked my mirrors, no other cars behind me, no reason to feel spooked. By the time I got to the next curve, I saw it again. The same billboard, the same car ad, and the same blinking lights, same pattern. Short, 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 long, 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 short, short, short. My first thought was that I had misremembered. Maybe I'd glanced at another sign earlier. But I didn't take any turns, didn't backtrack, and I had been driving straight for at least 25 miles. The highway was long and straight in this stretch, nothing for miles. I slowed the truck a little, checked the side roads. They were all empty. The pattern continued as I drove past. I blinked. That was when I noticed I was gripping the wheel tighter. I stopped at a small diner on the next exit to get my bearings. The place was empty except for the cook behind the counter. I asked about the billboard. He frowned. "Which one?" he said. "There's only one around here for miles." He made a hand gesture like he was pointing past the highway, then shrugged. "Lights aren't working tonight either. They've been out for a week." I laughed nervously, thinking maybe I just imagined the pattern. I drove back onto the highway, taking note of the fading light and the long shadows across the road. By now, the sun was halfway down, dipping behind some low hills. About 10 miles out, there it was again. Same billboard, same lights, same pattern. Short, 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 long, 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 short, short, short. I checked my truck's mirror again. Nothing behind me, no other vehicles, no turnoffs I'd missed. I tried rationalizing it. Maybe someone had set up a mobile display or some kind of reflector. But as I drove, the lights weren't just blinking randomly. They were precise. Too precise. Perfectly timed. Each flash identical. It had a mechanical feel, like some kind of signaling. I slowed to 50, then 40 miles per hour, trying to get a good look. Nothing on the ground. Nothing in the air. I felt sweat on the back of my neck. Then the third time happened. I didn't turn around. I hadn't even left the highway. I wasn't imagining anything. That billboard in the exact same spot I had seen before was there again, and the lights blinked the pattern again. I pulled over, heart thumping. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear anyone except the hum of my truck engine and the faint wind over the plains. I climbed out, walking up to the edge of the road. No tire marks, no tracks in the dirt, no wires or controls for the lights. Nothing but the billboard, standing empty. I got back in the truck, shaking my head. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I'd had too much coffee and sun. I drove a few more miles, keeping my eyes on the horizon, half expecting it to show up again. But it didn't. Not for another 30 miles, not even when the sky started to darken. I told myself it was over, that I just needed to get to the motel before dark. At the next town, I stopped at a gas station to fill up. The attendant, a young man named Harold, made small talk while he pumped gas. I mentioned the billboard. He gave me a strange look. "Billboard?" he asked. "You mean the old Ford ad? That thing's been empty for months. Lights haven't worked in weeks. Nobody around here would even know how to fix them." I thanked him, paid for the gas, and got back on the road. My mind was racing. If the lights weren't real, then what had I been seeing? But the pattern was burned into my memory. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, like a code. A signal. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I drove, and I swear I could feel something in the shadows beyond the roadside trees. Night fell completely before I reached the outskirts of Oklahoma City. The highway was empty, nothing but the sound of tires on asphalt and the occasional distant train whistle. I thought about stopping, calling someone to tell them what happened, but I had no one to call. Phones were only at pay stations, and I'd left the last town behind. Besides, who would believe a salesman from Tulsa seeing blinking lights on an empty billboard? I reached the motel, checked in, and parked under a street lamp. Something about the light outside made the interior of my truck feel safer. I sat there a long time trying to make sense of the day. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the mind, a heat-induced mirage or fatigue. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing more than a coincidence, but I knew better. I had seen it 3 times, and each time the lights were perfect. Each time the pattern didn't change. I finally went inside, paid for the room, and laid down on the bed. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept picturing the billboard against the dusk, the pattern of the lights repeating over and over. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of highways stretching endlessly, billboards appearing in the dark, and a series of blinking lights in the sky that seemed too deliberate to ignore. The next morning, I drove through the same stretch again, just to see. The highway was empty, normal, the sun bright and clear. The billboard stood there, yes, but the lights were gone, completely dark, wires rusting and faded. No pattern, no flashes. I stopped and got out, walked the dirt around it. Nothing. No mechanism, no sign of anything unusual. Just an old roadside advertisement, silently waiting for whoever might drive past. I left and kept driving. I haven't seen that pattern again, and I haven't gone back to that stretch of Route 66. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, driving some long, empty road, I swear I can see flashes of light just at the edge of my vision, in a rhythm that doesn't belong to anything I understand. And I can feel the memory of that day like a weight on my chest, the kind of memory that won't let go no matter how far I drive. I don't know what it was. I don't know why I saw it 3 times or why the lights blinked in that exact pattern. I only know that it happened, and that every time I think about it, I feel that same mix of disbelief and unease I felt on the highway in 1953, alone under the sun and dust, with blinking lights following me in a way I couldn't escape. I remember standing on the corner outside the little diner in Ashford, waiting for the payphone to free up. It was late, just past 9, and the fog had started rolling in off the river, thick and damp enough to make the streetlights look like halos. I was 15, wearing my school jacket over a button-down, fiddling with a coin in my pocket. My friend Marcy had asked me to call her, but the phone booth was already occupied, so I leaned against the wall, watching my breath curl in the cold air. When the line finally clicked free, I dropped in the nickel and lifted the receiver. The dial tone was faint, warbling like it had been stripped down and repaired one too many times. I dialed Marcy's number, trying not to think about the mist creeping up around my ankles, seeping through my shoes. The moment I hit the last digit, there was a click, and then something that made me freeze. A voice. It said my name. Flat, metallic, like it had been run through some machine. Walter Hughes, December 4th, 1939. I nearly dropped the receiver. I swallowed, trying to tell myself it was some prank, maybe one of the older kids messing around. But the street was empty, and the fog made even the diner look like a distant glow. Who is this? I managed, my voice higher than I wanted. The line was dead for a heartbeat. Then it repeated exactly the same. Walter Hughes, December 4th, 1939. I hung up, thinking maybe I had misheard, or maybe the line had cracked in a funny way. I tried dialing again. Nothing. Just dead silence, the faint hum of electricity in the wires. I looked around the corner, expecting to see someone lurking, but there was no one. Just fog and the yellowed light of the diner through the haze. I went inside to use the diner phone instead. I told the woman behind the counter, Mrs. Callahan, that I needed to call a friend. She handed me the receiver without a word. I dialed Marcy's number again. The phone rang once, twice, and then I heard a click, not the usual kind, but a long, low static hum. The same voice came through. Walter Hughes, December 4th, 1939. I slammed the receiver down. Mrs. Callahan came over, frowning. "You been talking to yourself, Walter?" she asked. I shook my head, but she gave me that look you get when you're a kid who doesn't understand adults' work. "The line never connected," she said. "No call ever came through. Not your friend, nobody." I blinked at her, confused. I called Marcy," I said. She shook her head. "Nobody answered. You didn't call anyone." I didn't argue. I couldn't. Something had happened, and it wasn't making sense. I paid for a cup of coffee with shaking hands, trying to ground myself. I told Marcy about it the next day, but she didn't believe me. Said I'd imagined it. Maybe I had, I thought at the time. Maybe I had just been tired, nerves fraying after school. But then the dream started. Not nightmares exactly, but that same voice repeating itself in my sleep. Sometimes it was clear, crisp, like the metallic whisper from the line. Other times it was distorted, stretching and bending around the edges, so I wasn't sure if I was awake or asleep. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that someone or something was in the room, watching. A few nights later, I went back to the corner, thinking maybe I'd been overreacting. The fog was heavier than before, and the street was empty. The diner's neon sign flickered faintly through the mist. I leaned against the phone booth, half expecting nothing to happen. I thought if I made the call again, I'd prove it was just a fluke. I lifted the receiver, dropped the coin in. I didn't even dial this time. The line clicked, and the voice said, "Walter Hughes, December 4th, 1939. I nearly dropped the phone. "How?" "What?" I stammered. The fog seemed to press closer, wrapping the street in soundless pressure. There was no one. I looked around, but the diner's windows were empty, the street empty. My hands were shaking. I hung up, and this time, I didn't go back. Over the next few weeks, things started disappearing. Little things at first. My school books would be out of place, notes I'd left on my desk gone, even some coins from my pocket when I came home. Not a lot. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make me question myself. I asked my parents, but they just said I was losing track of things. Maybe I was. But the voice never went away. Every so often when I was alone, I'd hear it just faintly saying my name. Sometimes it was in the static on the radio, sometimes in the hum of the refrigerator. Always the same, Walter Hughes, December 4th, 1939. I tried telling friends, but most of them laughed. They said it sounded like a story, a trick, or a dream. Nobody seemed to notice anything unusual. The diner, the street, even Mrs. Callahan all stayed the same. But I knew what I'd heard. I'd heard it clearly, and I could still remember it. One evening, I decided to try the phone again. I waited until the fog rolled in thick over Ashford. The streetlights haloed like soft lanterns in the mist. I walked to the corner, my feet squelching in the damp, and lifted the receiver. My heart was hammering, but I wanted answers, some sense that I hadn't lost my mind completely. The line clicked. Nothing at first, then a low, humming buzz. I expected the voice again, but it didn't come. Instead, there was silence for a long moment. Then a soft sound, almost like paper rustling, filled the earpiece. I froze. It was faint, irregular, and it didn't sound human. Not exactly. And then it stopped. I hung up slowly, listening to the fog pressing around the street. Nothing. No voice, no sound, just the quiet hum of the town. I walked home, trying to make sense of it. I told myself it was coincidence, imagination, maybe even some mechanical problem with the phone lines. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, listening, watching. After that, I avoided the payphones. I stuck to calling Marcy from her house or waiting until I got home. The voice didn't follow me everywhere, but it lingered in my mind. Sometimes I'd be sitting at the kitchen table, doing homework, and I'd swear I could hear it, just faintly, echoing from the walls. Years later, I went back to Ashford. The diner was gone, replaced by a small grocery store. The street was still quiet, fog rolling in from the river, the same as it had decades ago. I stood there for a long time, remembering the phone booth, the voice, and the way the fog had swallowed everything else. I don't know what it was, if it was some glitch in the phone lines or something else entirely. I never heard the voice repeat my birth date again after I left town, but the memory stayed with me. Sometimes late at night, I think I can feel that same quiet, mechanical presence in the edges of a room, just beyond the reach of light. And it makes me wonder how many things we notice, just for a moment, that don't have explanations waiting for us. I never went near that payphone again. I don't even want to think about it. But the sound of a line clicking, faint static, or a mechanical whisper still makes me stop. And I can't shake the memory of that foggy street, the diner, and the voice saying my name, repeating my birth date, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I'd been out on the bay in my little skiff before dawn, the water calm and flat like glass. The year was 1954, and I had gotten used to the quiet mornings, just me, the gulls, and the smell of salt on the breeze. I wasn't much for company anyway. I'd shoved off from the dock in Marshport around 3, expecting to spend a couple of hours hauling in whatever the tide wanted to give me. The sun hadn't broken over the horizon yet, but the water had this silver shimmer that made it almost like daylight. I started pulling in the net a little after 3:30, the usual rhythm of lifting, shaking, and setting it back down. Usually I'd find a decent catch, small cod or maybe some flounder tangled up in the corners. That morning, though, something felt wrong. The net came up heavier than usual, but there wasn't much movement in the weave. When I leaned over to peek inside, I froze. Every fish was dead. Flat on their sides, mouths open, gills still, scales faintly glowing like they were lit from within. Not the kind of glow you'd get from moonlight or reflection. It was almost phosphorescent. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I must be seeing things, but when I looked again, they were the same. I'd been fishing Marshport Bay for 20 years, and I'd never seen anything like it. My first thought was contamination, maybe some chemical runoff from the factories upriver, but the glow, that made no sense, and the smell wasn't chemical, it was just faintly metallic, but not strong. I tilted the net, half expecting the fish to jump back to life. They didn't. Not a twitch. I sat back on the edge of the skiff and stared out toward the open water, trying to shake it off. The mist was thick, low over the surface, and I could barely see past 50 yards. Then I noticed something just beyond the end of my oars, hovering above the water, maybe 100 feet out. At first, I thought it was the fog catching the moon, but it wasn't moving with the wind. It was a smooth, silvery shape, low over the waves, and it was completely silent. I couldn't make out details, just a blur of reflective metal. My stomach went tight. I wanted to reach for the net, maybe splash water to see if it would react, but I couldn't move. I just watched. It stayed there, not more than a few feet above the water, almost floating. Then, very slowly, it started to rise. Not up the way a plane climbs, nothing mechanical about it, just straight up, smooth, steady. I blinked, and in a heartbeat it was gone, just gone. No sound, no disturbance on the water. 1 second it was there, the next nothing. I leaned forward, searching the fog, straining my eyes, but the shape had vanished entirely. The mist didn't shift, the wind didn't change, nothing. Just gone. The dead fish in the net were still there, but I couldn't shake the feeling I'd been watched. My hands were trembling and my chest felt tight. I shook the net again, half hoping I was hallucinating, and saw the fish shimmer faintly in the dim light. I dropped the net back over the side, but I didn't want to touch them anymore. They floated there for a moment, and then I noticed something else. The water around the net was glowing just a bit, like the fish had left a trail, or maybe the glow was seeping into the water itself. I leaned closer and the light dimmed when I breathed over it. I jerked back. Nothing made sense. I started paddling back toward the dock, trying to keep calm. My mind raced with explanations. Military tests? Some new kind of chemical? But nothing I'd ever heard of could make fish glow and hover a strange object in silence above the bay. Halfway in, I noticed movement on the horizon, just the faintest flicker in the fog. Another shape, maybe the same one, or maybe a reflection. It was low, just above the water, moving slowly toward me. I froze. My paddle slipped, and I had to grab it to stop it from clattering against the boat. The thing slowed as if it was aware of me, just hovering there. Then it drifted to the side, out of my direct line of sight, and vanished behind a thick bank of fog. I finally reached the dock around 6, exhausted and shaking. The town was waking up, lanterns lit, people moving about. I said nothing at first. Who'd believe me? I unloaded the nets, trying to keep my hands steady. A few neighbors came by asking about the early catch. I lied, said the tide had been slow. One of the old-timers, Ed Whitaker, noticed my hands shaking and asked what was wrong. I just muttered something about a cold wind and went inside my shack. I didn't even touch breakfast. Over the next few days, I kept going back out. The fish were back to normal in the bay. No more glow, no more dead nets. Nothing unusual, save just my boat and the water and the gulls. I tried not to think about it, but the memory of that silver shape hovering above the water wouldn't leave me. Some nights I'd wake up hearing faint humming sounds over the bay, or catch a glint of something reflective in the fog when I wasn't expecting it. It was never there when I got closer, though, just a flicker at the edge of my vision. A week later, I spoke with my friend Sam, who ran the bait shop. He said a few fishermen had come in around the same time, saying their nets were strange that morning too, but none of them mentioned glowing fish. I didn't ask more. Talking about it felt wrong, like mentioning it would make it real again. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in, I swear I see that silver blur low over the water again. I slow my boat down, watch the ripples, and the shape will appear and vanish before I can even point. No sound, no movement except the hovering, and the water seems to shiver like it knows something I don't. I've tried everything to explain it, the tides, the fog, chemicals, my imagination, but it doesn't fit. And the glow on the fish, that's the part that haunts me the most. Like they'd been lit from something beyond me, something I can't see. I've stopped fishing alone at night. I don't trust it. But sometimes the early morning fog is too perfect, too quiet, and I'll find myself looking out over the water, wondering if it's back again, just hovering, waiting, silent, and shining faintly in the mist. I was on my way back from the diner that night. The clock in the little cafe read just past midnight. Main Street was quiet, the kind of quiet you don't notice until it's broken. The few cars parked along the curb seemed oddly still, like they'd been waiting for something. I had finished my coffee, tipped the waitress, Miss Langley, she always kept the sugar canister spotless, and stepped out into the damp air. The street smelled faintly of rain and wet asphalt, though no clouds were moving overhead. I just started toward my car when it happened. Every streetlight along Main flickered out at the same time. One instant they were buzzing overhead, humming their yellow-orange glow. The next they were dead, black pools of silence. I froze, thinking maybe it was a fuse or some kind of power failure. It wasn't the first time a stormy night had knocked the lights out, but the sky wasn't stormy. I took a step forward, then another. That's when I noticed the other folks. Mrs. Callahan from the bakery, Joe Carter, the bank clerk, and a few others were standing in the darkness, looking up, heads tilted, mouths slightly open. Their voices were low, murmuring, uncertain. I didn't hear what they were saying at first, just the sound of someone shifting their weight, the scrape of shoes on wet asphalt, and then the lights came back on. One by one, the bulbs hummed and buzzed, spilling their familiar glow back onto the street. That's when I saw it, or at least what the others were staring at. It was massive. I don't mean just big. I mean it took up a section of the sky like you'd hung a tarp across the stars. It wasn't like a plane or a balloon. It had no lights of its own, no shape you could describe clearly, just a dark, solid blot against the night. People were whispering, pointing, but there was no sound coming from the thing itself. I think I might have stepped back without realizing it, just trying to get a better view, or maybe trying to convince myself it wasn't there. Mr. Carter muttered something about clouds, but the sky was clear. Mrs. Callahan said, almost under her breath, that she felt cold, like the air had shifted, and the others nodded. Then, just as quietly as it had appeared, it was gone. Not with a rush or a sweep, but like someone had taken a sponge to the night. One moment the stars were blocked, the next they were there, pinpricks of light in the black sky, and the streetlights were humming normally again. Nobody moved for a few seconds, just staring, breathing shallow, unsure of what had happened. I walked closer to Joe Carter. "Did you see that?" I asked. He paled. "I saw it, and it wasn't moving, not like anything I know." The strange thing was, no one really wanted to talk about it after that. We drifted back to our homes, glancing over our shoulders, some of us whispering about the shadow, but no one wanted to go into details. It felt wrong, like talking about it would make it real again. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept picturing the shape, trying to sketch it in my mind, but it was impossible. My sketches on paper didn't match what I remembered. There were angles and edges that didn't make sense, impossible proportions that shouldn't exist. I remember looking out my window at the sky, thinking I'd see it again, and the street beyond my porch was empty, quiet, just the usual faint creak of a sign swinging in the night breeze. The next morning, the town was talking in hushed tones. Some said they'd seen it too. Others claimed the lights never went out, that they had been asleep through the whole thing. I even heard that the power company found no problems on the line. Nothing to explain the blackout, nothing to explain the blot of darkness. Over the next week, I kept an eye on Main Street at night, sometimes lingering at the diner's corner just past midnight. Nothing happened. Streetlights buzzed normally, the night sky stretched clear and infinite. I tried not to mention it to most people. Talking about it made me feel like I was tempting something to show itself again. A few nights later, though, something else happened. I was walking back from a late errand, my coat pulled tight against the chill. I saw a flicker in the alley behind the general store. A shadow, quick and sharp, gone before I could focus. The street was empty, the night air still. It didn't feel like a person. There wasn't a smell or footsteps or anything that would suggest someone was there. Just a flicker, like the corner of my vision was being cut out. I told myself it was a trick of the streetlight, that my mind was replaying the first blackout. But when I passed the alley again, I noticed the wet asphalt looked different, faintly glossy, like someone had brushed it, smoothed it, but no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. I stepped back, unsure why I expected anything to be there. The most unnerving part came the following night. I was in my car, idling at the diner's lot, thinking I'd watch the street. I don't know why I kept looking up at the sky, maybe hoping I could prove to myself nothing would happen. That's when the lights on Main flickered again. All of them at once. My stomach dropped. I didn't see the blot this time. I just felt it, a heaviness, not in the air exactly, but in the space around me, pressing down. It lasted less than a minute. When the lights came back, the lot looked exactly as it had before. Empty, quiet, ordinary. I drove home slowly, glancing in every shadow, listening for any sound that didn't belong. For months afterward, I kept an eye on the streetlights, my sleep broken by the memory of that shape. Sometimes, when I passed Main late at night, I'd see the folks from the town still looking up, unsure, waiting. Not all of them, just a handful. I never approached them. They seemed changed, like they had seen something that marked them, even if they couldn't talk about it. I don't know what it was. I don't know why it happened. And I don't know why it chose that one clear, quiet night in 1954 to appear over Main Street. Every so often, when I'm walking alone and the night is still, I catch a flicker, a shadow out of the corner of my eye, and I think of that black shape that blocked the stars. I look up, hoping the lights will stay steady, hoping that whatever it was has moved on, and for now, it usually has. But I keep watch. I don't tell people much about it. They'd laugh or call me crazy. It wasn't like a story you could prove. Just a blackout, a shadow, and a handful of townsfolk who swear they saw something no one could explain. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's still up there, waiting, keeping track of us while the lights keep burning on Main Street. I was heading home from visiting my cousin in the valley when it started to get dark. The sky was overcast, low clouds pressing down on the fields, making everything look gray and damp. I'd been walking along the dirt road that cuts between my uncle's farm and the old Johnson place, just kicking at stones and thinking about supper. That's when I first noticed the little plane. It was small, like a crop duster, but its lights were what caught my attention. They blinked in patterns that didn't make sense, almost like Morse code, but not regular. One red, one green, one white, all flickering in irregular sequences. I stopped and squinted, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks. The plane was low, coming down toward that big open field near the creek. I didn't hear an engine at first, just the distant hiss of wind, but then a faint whirring joined in, like it was settling onto the ground. I started walking toward the field, calling out, thinking maybe the pilot needed help. My boots sank into the wet dirt and mud, and everything smelled like wet grass and cold earth. When I got closer, I noticed there was nobody inside. I leaned over the wing and peeked into the cockpit. Empty. The controls were untouched, the engine off. The cabin smelled faintly of fuel, but it was cool, not like it had been running recently. I stepped back, trying to make sense of it. Maybe the owner ran off, I muttered to myself. But the doors were locked from the inside, and I didn't see any footprints leading away. The field was just a flat stretch of mud and grass. I circled the plane a few times, shining my flashlight along the wheels and tail. Everything was normal, except for the way the lights had stopped blinking once I got close, then started again after I moved a few paces away. I glanced down the road, half expecting someone to appear, maybe a farmer or a mechanic from town. Nobody. I felt a prickle along my neck, that same uneasy feeling you get when the world suddenly seems too quiet. Then I heard something faint, like the distant scraping of metal across stone, but it didn't make sense. The only metal around was the plane. I spun toward it. The cockpit was still empty, but the lights were shifting, blinking faster now, not following any rhythm I could figure out. I thought about running, but something held me there. Maybe curiosity. I took a step closer again. That's when I noticed it. Faint marks in the mud around the plane, circular, like the wheels had been lifted and moved in small arcs. Not just the plane's wheels either. Some of the prints didn't match anything I recognized. Smaller, almost like they had fingers. I bent down, poking at them with a stick. The mud had set, but the impressions were sharp, deliberate. I pulled back when the wind picked up suddenly. Not a gust, but a steady pressure that pressed against my chest. The clouds overhead shifted, revealing a thin streak of sky for a moment, then they closed again. The lights on the plane reflected off the wet grass, making everything look like it was moving in waves. My flashlight started flickering, even though the batteries were fine. I shook it and it worked again. I thought about shouting for help, but my voice didn't sound right, not in the open field. Too sharp, too echoing, like it wasn't mine. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but then I noticed shadows moving in the tree line along the creek. Nothing solid, just darker shapes that didn't belong. I froze. They weren't running or walking, just shifting, like watching me. The plane's lights went out completely for a moment, and when they came back, the blinking sequence had changed again. Not random anymore, but deliberate. I had the sense that whatever was out there in the shadows was trying to communicate or test me. I don't know. I took a step backward, and the shapes in the trees moved slightly, keeping pace, though the distance didn't change. I glanced at the cockpit again. Empty. I checked the tail, the wings. Nothing unusual. The field was quiet except for the wind and the faint hum of the plane itself, like it had power but wasn't running. I bent down and touched the metal, cold, not from the weather, but from something else. My hand tingled. I shook it off and stepped back. I debated leaving, but then I realized I had no idea which way home would be safest. The dirt road disappeared into darkness, and the shapes along the creek had disappeared too. 1 second they were there, watching. The next, gone. The plane sat there, blinking its lights, inviting or daring me to come closer. I decided to circle the field, see if there was another way out. Mud squelched under my boots, and I tried not to look at the cockpit. My heart kept thumping, a slow, heavy beat. That's when I noticed something else. The air smelled different. Not bad, not sharp, just wrong. I can't explain it. Like metal and rain mixed with something sweet, faint, almost unnoticeable until you realized it was everywhere. I walked toward the edge of the field where the Johnson's barn should have been, hoping to find a fence or a road I recognized. That's when I heard a soft thump behind me. I whipped around. Nothing. Then another, rhythmical, like a footstep or maybe something heavier. I ran a little, then stopped, gasping. The plane's lights weren't blinking anymore, just steady, dim glows from each wingtip. I moved closer, the urge to know what was going on stronger than my fear. The cockpit was still empty. The engine remained cold. I pressed my palm against the fuselage again. That tingling returned, but stronger this time, as if the metal itself was alive. I yanked my hand away and stepped back. And then, without any sound or warning, the lights blinked rapidly, once, twice, then all at once. The sequence flashed so fast it almost made my eyes water, like a code I couldn't read. I stumbled back, covering my face, and when I looked again, the field was empty. The plane was gone. I spun around. No tire tracks, no mud disturbed beyond what I'd made walking. Nothing, just the open field and the dark sky pressing down. I ran toward the road, my boots sinking into the mud, until I reached a fence line I recognized. Once I was back on the main dirt road, I looked over my shoulder. The field looked untouched. I kept walking until I saw lights from the Johnson place in the distance, and didn't stop until I was safely on the porch. I told my uncle about it. He shook his head and said maybe I'd seen a prank or a small aircraft that had landed for some reason. But nobody had reported a plane, and nobody had gone to check the field that night. I thought about it for months. Every time I tried to explain what I'd seen, the lights, the prints, the shadows, I ended up shrugging. There's no proof, only my memory. And it feels like a memory of something that didn't belong in the world I knew. Years later, I still think about it when I pass that field. Sometimes the wind shifts in a certain way, and I swear I can see faint glimmers moving along the grass like lights blinking just out of reach. I don't go there anymore, not at night. But I still remember the feeling of being watched, the metal under my hands, and the way the air tasted different for a few minutes that evening in 1953. Nothing else explains it. I was running the soda fountain at Miller's Hall that Saturday night. The place was packed. Everybody from town and a few from the county over had come for the dance. My job mostly meant pouring drinks, but I kept an eye on the record player, making sure the music didn't skip. I was 19, a bit nervous around crowds, but I liked the hum of a Saturday night. Laughter, heels clicking on the floor, and the brass band records spinning on the Victrola. Around 11, the band's record slowed. I thought someone had fiddled with it, or maybe the spring in the turntable was giving out. But then the song stopped entirely. Just dead. The lights in the hall stayed on. Nothing tripped in the fuse box. I leaned over the machine, checking the arm, the spindle, and the needle. Everything looked fine, but the record wouldn't move. I tried nudging it, jiggling the crank, even swapping it out with another record. Still nothing. I stepped back, scratching my head. And that's when I noticed some of the dancers looking toward the windows. At first, I figured someone had parked a truck with its headlights in front of the hall, but that didn't explain the shapes or the color. A few of the younger kids pressed their faces to the glass, pointing and whispering. "Look," one of them said. I walked over to the side window nearest the parking lot. The sky was clear, though heavy with the blackness of night. At first, I thought it was just a street lamp reflecting off the clouds, but then I saw it, the glow. A pale, almost greenish light hovering above the hall. It didn't move like a plane, not with any wings I could make out. Just there, silently, casting a soft wash over the rooftops and the road. I could see a few adults stepping outside, shielding their eyes, murmuring. No one spoke much. People just stood, frozen, watching. The glow didn't flicker or flash, it stayed steady, almost like it was looking down at us. I noticed the hairs on my neck prickle and tried to tell myself it was some kind of experiment or lantern someone had launched, but there was no rope, no string, no anything, just the light. Then, without warning, the record player started again on its own. Not with a nudge, not with me touching it. The song picked up at exactly the point it had stopped. I swear I didn't touch anything. My hands were at my sides the entire time. The music had an odd echo, like the sound was stretched just a little too long, but it played through. I stepped outside after a moment, telling myself I needed some air, maybe to shake off the weirdness of the stopped record. The glow had shifted slightly, now hovering nearer to the tree line behind the hall. It was difficult to judge the distance. There was no sound, no hum, nothing to give away its size or speed. I tried to see its shape, but the edges were blurred, like a cloud lit from inside. Some of the kids had wandered back in by then. A few older men were whispering together, hands shading their eyes. One of them, a man named Harold, who ran the gas station down the road, muttered, "I've seen lights over the plains before, but never like that." I nodded, not sure if I wanted to admit how little I understood. I looked back at the hall. Through the front windows, the dancing continued. Nobody seemed to notice the glow now. Maybe they couldn't see it from their angle. Or maybe they had, and it didn't matter. I couldn't tell if I was relieved or more unsettled. I turned back toward the object. My eyes kept catching tiny movements around it, flickers like shadows passing in front of the glow. I thought I saw figures, thin and elongated, but whenever I blinked or shifted my gaze, they disappeared. No one else seemed to notice them. I finally walked closer to the tree line, trying to get a better look. The glow remained just above the edge of the woods, but now I thought I could make out a pattern in its light, almost like the surface was covered in small panels reflecting the moonlight unevenly. Or maybe my mind was filling in shapes where there were none. I stopped myself from moving too close. The feeling was heavy, almost physical, pressing at my chest. After a few minutes, it drifted slightly to the east. Not quickly, not like an airplane or helicopter, just shifting, as though the air itself was carrying it. I blinked, and it seemed a little farther than before. I called out to Harold and the other men, but my voice felt swallowed by the night. By the time they turned toward me, the light had risen higher, then tilted silently and vanished, faster than anything I could track. Nobody said much after that. The band played on, the dancers carried on, and I poured sodas and lemonade in a daze. I couldn't get the image out of my head, the light, the way it moved, the fleeting shapes I thought I saw. I left Miller's Hall around 1 a.m. The roads were empty. I drove my little Ford through the countryside, lights on, eyes scanning the trees, the sky. Not a flicker, not a trace. Just the same quiet night I'd driven through 100 times before. When I got home, I told my parents I was late because I'd been helping at the hall. They didn't question it, and I didn't try to explain more. The next morning, I rode back past Miller's Hall. Nothing. The parking lot was empty, the hall quiet. No signs of anything unusual. I tried to tell a few friends about it later, but it didn't go over well. They laughed it off, balloons, lanterns, whatever. I didn't have an explanation, and I couldn't offer one. The strange part is, I never really forgot it. Some nights when I walk outside and the sky is clear, I look for something similar, but nothing comes. The memory lingers, though. The slow stop of the record, the greenish glow, and that stillness that felt heavier than anything I'd felt before or since. I don't know what I saw that night. I only know it wasn't a plane or a meteor or anything ordinary. And I know that for a few minutes, Miller's Hall, with all its music and laughter, felt small and fragile under that quiet light. I guess I've told myself it was a trick of the mind, shadows and reflections playing with the dark. But every so often, even now when I hear a record slow and stop unexpectedly, I feel the same weight in my chest, like the world is holding its breath. I was on the 9:15 from Cedar Rapids to Chicago. It was late, probably close to midnight, and the station was mostly empty. I had a suitcase and a coat that had seen better days. I was looking forward to sleeping most of the way, maybe reading a little, the way I always did. When I got on the train, I moved from car to car, checking where people were sitting. Everything seemed normal. A few businessmen with newspapers, a couple of families dozing off, the usual quiet hum of the train at night. When I got to the third car from the back, I noticed it immediately. It was empty except for one man. He was sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness, not looking at the tracks, not at the stations we passed, just staring. I didn't get a good look at his face at first because the dim overhead light flickered a little, but something about him made me uneasy. He wore a dark overcoat and a hat pulled low, so I could barely see his eyes. I found a seat across the aisle, keeping him in my peripheral vision. I kept expecting him to turn or say something, but he didn't. The train rattled on through the night. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, it felt like the car itself went silent. No hum from the engine, no clatter of the wheels, just that quiet space around him. I looked at the window across from him and realized the reflection didn't match him perfectly. The head in the glass was slightly off, the movements delayed, like it was a second behind. I shook my head, thinking maybe I was imagining it. After a few stops, a few more passengers entered, walking through the car. The man didn't acknowledge anyone. The conductor came by, checked tickets, and even he didn't seem to notice him. I leaned over to ask a young woman sitting near me if she'd seen him, but she just frowned and said she hadn't. I noticed other passengers starting to glance that way, whispering to each other. A few sat down near the car door, but none of them got close. They moved on after a minute, like something about the space made them uneasy. I tried reading my book again, but I couldn't focus. The man shifted once, very slowly, and when he did, the overhead light flickered hard, like it went out for a second and came back. I blinked and realized he was looking straight at me now. Or at least I thought he was. It's hard to tell with shadows and dim light. My stomach tightened. The train slowed into a station I didn't recognize. The lights from the platform spilled into the car. I thought maybe I'd finally get a better look at him, but as soon as we stopped, he stood up, not in a normal way. There was no sound of his coat or hat moving, just this smooth, quiet motion. He walked toward the door at the other end of the car and disappeared through it. I stood up to follow, but the door didn't open. I tried the handle, and it was locked from the inside. I called for the conductor, but he was gone before I could explain. I checked the rest of the train, every car forward and back. No man, no sign he had ever been there. The seats he had been sitting in were empty, just normal, like nobody had been there at all. I went back to my seat in the third car. The overhead light flickered again. When it stabilized, I looked at the window. He was there, standing on the other side outside the train. But the tracks were empty. No platform, no people, just the darkness stretching away. I swear I could see him tilt his head slightly toward me, like he knew I could see him. Then he was gone. I kept thinking maybe I had dozed off for a minute, that it was a dream. But my coat was still wrinkled from where I'd sat. My suitcase was in the aisle. Everything was in the same place I'd left it. After that, I couldn't sit still. I moved forward to the next car, and a couple of other passengers noticed I was tense. I tried to make small talk, but I kept glancing back toward the empty car. Every time the lights flickered, I thought I saw movement in the window at the far end. It wasn't clear, just shadows, but my chest would tighten. I found a conductor again at a later stop and told him what I'd seen. He frowned, then said that the third car had been checked before departure. No passengers had been there at all. He shrugged, told me it was late and people were tired, and went back to his duties. I tried to ignore it, focused on the dark shapes outside the window, the regular click of the wheels. I felt watched, though. Every stop, every station. I kept looking back, expecting that figure to appear in the doorway again. But it never did. By the time the train slowed into Chicago, I was shaking, exhausted, and relieved to step onto the platform. Outside, the streets were quiet. I paid a cab driver to take me home, looking over my shoulder the whole way. The streetlights felt weak and far apart. Every time a shadow shifted, I flinched. When I got into my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, breathing heavily. I kept imagining him standing outside, waiting for the moment I looked away. I checked the papers the next day, just in case someone had mentioned a missing passenger or strange occurrence on the train. Nothing. My neighbors, friends, everyone I asked said the trains ran normally, and nobody had seen anything unusual. It wasn't until weeks later, when I told a friend at the office, that I realized nobody else remembered him. Not the man, not the flickering light, not the empty car, only me. I didn't mention it again to anyone else, just tried to act like it hadn't happened. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can see him, standing by the window, hat low, staring out, not moving, just observing. And I still can't figure out what exactly I saw or why I was the only one who did. I was in my living room, the radio humming low behind me, and the whole neighborhood seemed to be leaning into the tiny flickering television like it held the evening itself. It was 1955, and Quiz Night Live had drawn every family in our small town to their sets. I remember sitting on the edge of the worn sofa, my sister Peggy beside me, both of us trying to remember the answers to questions about geography and history while the rest of the room smelled faintly of soap and the butter Dad had melted over popcorn. Then it happened. The screen didn't just flicker, it twisted, almost like someone had hit it with a fist, though no one in the room had moved. For a fraction of a second, the image on the screen shifted from the host's cheery face to something entirely different. It was wide, low to the ground, and metallic, reflecting the pale moonlight. Or maybe the studio lights from the broadcast, I couldn't tell. It hovered above a field of corn, swaying slowly as though it were floating on air currents we couldn't feel. There were no people, no cars, nothing else in sight, just the machine, quiet and perfectly still. I blinked, and it was gone. The broadcast resumed as if nothing had happened. The host was smiling, cheerily introducing the next round of questions. Peggy and I froze, staring at the screen, both of us aware of how unnatural that moment had felt. I jumped up and ran to the front window, thinking maybe I'd misread some shadow outside. But the street was quiet, empty. The gas lamps cast the usual yellow glow, and the wind whispered through the trees. Nothing moved. I ran over to the phone to call Mr. Harlan next door, but Peggy grabbed my arm. "Wait. Ask him in the morning," she said, though her face looked pale under the lamplight. "We'll sound like fools." I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the metallic shape hovering over the corn, the way it reflected light, the absolute stillness of it. The next day at the diner, I tried bringing it up to folks who had watched the show. I asked Mr. Clark, who ran the grocery across from the town square. "Did anyone else see that flicker?" I said. He looked at me blankly and shook his head. "Flicker? No, not at all. Show ran fine." I asked Mrs. Abbott, whose house sat behind the gas station, and she said the same thing. "What flicker? Oh, you mean the technical difficulty? There wasn't any." I was starting to feel ridiculous. Peggy refused to talk about it, muttering that maybe I'd fallen asleep and dreamed it. But I knew I hadn't. My mother asked why I looked so tired, and I told her I stayed up too late. She patted my shoulder and went back to the stove, never asking further. It wasn't just the broadcast, though. Over the next few nights, strange things happened around town. Lights flickered even when the wiring was fine. Shadows moved oddly along the sides of buildings. I saw a neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, standing in the yard, staring up at nothing, for what felt like 10 minutes straight before he walked back inside. Nobody mentioned him standing there. Nobody had noticed him. I began keeping a journal, scribbling down times, observations, feelings. I wrote down the date the broadcast flickered, noting that it had been precisely at 8:17 p.m. Then the next night, the street lamps outside my house pulsed faintly in a rhythm that almost seemed deliberate. It wasn't the wind, not exactly. It felt too patterned, too careful. One evening, I decided to walk the edge of the cornfields just to see if the shape I'd glimpsed on the television had any counterpart in real life. The fields stretched out flat under a sky that was dark and heavy with clouds, and I kept my coat wrapped tight against a cold wind that wasn't there before. I didn't see the craft, there was nothing, but I could feel something. A sense of being watched, like I was a bird under a branch waiting for some movement. I ran back home, heart pounding, convinced that shadows moved at the edge of my vision, but every time I turned, there was nothing. The next week, I tried mentioning the broadcast to friends, thinking maybe someone else had seen the flicker. Most insisted the show looked normal. A few, like my cousin Harold, laughed nervously and said I'd been staring at the set too long. Only my sister admitted she had seen something odd, though she described it vaguely, and then changed the subject when our mother entered the room. Things escalated a bit more when the local theater ran a special late showing of the weekly newsreel. Just before the reel started, the lights dimmed, and for a second, the projector skipped. There it was again, a bright flash, a gleam, then the same metallic outline hovering over cornfields, seen through the scratchy, grainy lens of the newsreel. I jerked in my seat, knocking my coat onto the floor. People glanced at me but didn't seem to notice anything unusual. When I asked my neighbor, Mr. Tate, afterward, he said the newsreel ran fine. What flash? What metallic thing? I started seeing the shape elsewhere, too. At the county fair, it appeared in the reflection of the Ferris wheel lights, just for a second. At the church bazaar, in a puddle outside, The reflection shimmered oddly, like metal hovering over the cornfields, but there was nothing above the puddle. I told Peggy, who stopped replying to my comments, and even my journal began to feel insufficient. It reached a peak one night when I drove home late from the diner. The main road cut through open farmland, and the night was clear. The stars scattered thin and cold. My headlights caught a shimmer in the distance, low in the cornfield. I slowed, thinking it might be a deer or some scrap metal. But as I got closer, the shape shifted, angular and metallic, hovering just above the rows. My engine stalled in my chest. I could barely breathe. Then, as I blinked, or maybe as I looked away for a moment, it vanished. No trace, not even in the corn pressed flat by wind. I drove faster after that, keeping the windows up and my eyes forward, shaking all the way home. Inside, the house felt normal, safe. Peggy was reading by lamplight, my mother humming at the stove. I didn't mention the night again, and over time, the events began to fade from conversations. People returned to ordinary routines, but I couldn't forget. Months later, I was at a gathering at the town hall. Someone mentioned the broadcast again, laughing about technical difficulties. A chill ran through me. "Which night?" I asked quietly. Nobody remembered anything unusual, not one flicker, not one metallic shape over the corn. They all described it as ordinary, cheerful, flawless. I started keeping a schedule, noting when and where I saw shadows move oddly, or lights flicker in patterns that weren't explained. Sometimes I wondered if it was me, if I'd been imagining things, straining to see oddities where there were none. But other times I could swear I felt the shape watching, waiting, always just out of reach. Eventually, life went on. Peggy married, the diner changed hands, the county fair returned every summer. And yet, on quiet nights, when the wind is low and the moon leans pale over the cornfields, I can still see that shape reflected in the dark, hovering, perfectly still, metallic and waiting, as if it were never gone at all. Even now, in the daylight, I sometimes glance at the fields from the car window, thinking I catch a shimmer, just at the edge of sight. It never comes closer, never signals, never touches. But it lingers, like a question I can't answer, and a broadcast that only some of us ever truly saw. And I don't tell anyone. I first saw him when I was coming back from the diner, walking down Main Street toward my apartment. It was late, probably close to midnight. The town was mostly dark. A few lights flickered in the windows of the general store and the cafe. I remember seeing him standing under the street lamp near the post office, just watching the street like he belonged there. That part alone didn't seem so strange at first. Drifters did pass through town, but something about the way he was dressed caught my eye. His suit looked old, maybe from the 30s, pressed and spotless like it had never been worn. The shoes didn't have a mark on them, and the coat was buttoned perfectly. In a town where most folks had dust on their boots and frayed collars, he stuck out. He noticed me before I got close. He gave me a little nod, polite but deliberate. I hesitated for a moment because something about him felt off. He wasn't like the other drifters I'd seen. He didn't look tired, didn't fumble for coins or wander aimlessly. His eyes were calm but alert, like he was reading the street in a way no stranger should. "Evening," he said. His voice was quiet but clear. "Could you tell me where I might find Willow Street?" I frowned. Willow Street didn't exist, at least not in our town. I've lived here most of my life, and there's no Willow Street, just maple, pine, and oak. There isn't a Willow Street here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled, just slightly, not in a mocking way, but as if he'd expected that answer. "I could have sworn it was here, right past the intersection near the bakery." I shook my head. "No, sir, there's nothing like that. The bakery's still there, though. You can't miss it on Oak." He nodded slowly, looking down the street the way I was supposed to. Then he cocked his head as if considering something else. "And what of Mr. Coleridge? I was told he lives near the corner of Chestnut and Vine." My stomach twisted. Mr. Coleridge lived 2 streets over. Yes, but no one had mentioned him to a stranger. And I hadn't even met the guy yet. The drifter shouldn't have known his name. I opened my mouth to say something, but he interrupted. "Or perhaps I misremember. I've been on the road for so long it all blurs." I wanted to step back. The street was quiet, except for the occasional hum of a far-off truck. I noticed that though he looked ordinary enough, there was something about his movements that was just not quite right. He didn't shift his weight the way a person does, like you expect someone to breathe in rhythm with the world around them. He was precise. He turned his head smoothly, scanned the buildings, the windows, the empty street, without a hint of the hesitation I associate with someone unfamiliar with a place. "Maybe I've taken a wrong turn," he said finally. "Could you point me to the center of town?" I hesitated again, feeling like a child caught off guard. You're already on Main," I said. "The center's right down that way." I pointed vaguely toward the diner and the clock tower. He nodded, and for a moment I thought he might leave, but instead he paused, looking down Main like he was trying to remember something. Then he smiled faintly, almost wistfully. "I suppose it doesn't matter. The directions I'm given rarely match the streets I walk." That sentence stuck with me. It wasn't odd in a casual way. It was wrong. People didn't talk like that. It was formal, deliberate, like a line rehearsed too many times. I decided to leave him alone, took a few steps back toward my apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was still standing there under the lamp, not moving, just looking. Then, he did something stranger. He lifted one hand and waved slightly, not at me, not a casual wave, just a small, deliberate movement, like he was acknowledging something only he could see. Over the next few days, I kept running into him in the oddest places. The grocery store, the town library, the old church at the edge of town. Each time he asked questions that didn't make sense. "Is the Smithson place still there? The one with the white picket fence?" No one in town had called it that in years. "I was told the train passes here. It should have come through an hour ago." But the train schedule didn't mention anything for another 3 days. I started keeping notes because I couldn't understand what I was seeing. He never interacted with anyone except to ask these odd questions. People would glance at him and look away quickly, but he never seemed to notice. And sometimes when I looked at him, I had this weird impression, like his eyes were tracking something behind me, just out of reach. One night, I saw him near the edge of town, past the fields where the corn was starting to grow. It was foggy, the kind of fog that clings low to the ground, muffles sound. He was standing near the railroad tracks, staring into the mist. I walked over, curiosity getting the better of me. "You shouldn't be here," I said softly. He turned to me, smiled faintly. And yet, here I am. His eyes didn't follow me the way normal eyes do. They seemed fixed on a point beyond the fog. "I've been told to wait for the evening light, but it comes slowly here." I wanted to ask what he meant, but the words wouldn't come. The fog rolled thicker between us, and I noticed something else. The town behind us was completely silent. No dogs barking, no crickets, not even the faint rumble of the train in the distance. Just nothing. Then he started walking along the tracks, slowly, deliberately. I followed at a distance, trying to keep the road between us and whatever I thought might be behind him. After a few minutes, he stopped, turned, and looked at me. The path doesn't always appear as you remember. That line made my stomach tighten. I wanted to ask again, what path? But something in his expression made me hold my tongue. He didn't wait for me to answer. He turned and vanished into the fog, the way someone disappears down a street, except there were no footprints. Nothing to show he had been there. I spent the rest of that night walking back to my apartment, my mind spinning. By morning, there was no sign he had been in town at all. No footprints, no marks in the dirt, not even the faint scent of his coat. I asked a few people if they had seen anyone matching his description, but no one had. The odd part is, I still caught glimpses of him now and then. A corner of the library shelf, a shadow under the street lamp, a shape moving past the bakery window. Always gone when I looked directly. Eventually, I stopped trying to follow him. I couldn't tell whether he was real or if he was some trick of the fog and the quiet streets. But sometimes, late at night, I walk past Main Street and swear I see that old suit, spotless and pressed, waiting under the lamp, and I feel the same unease, like the town itself is holding its breath. I never saw him talk to anyone else. I never heard his voice, except when it carried directly to me. And sometimes when I think of that night on the tracks, I get the sense he wasn't even waiting for me. Not really. He was waiting for something else, something I couldn't see, something that wasn't supposed to be here. I don't know who he was. I don't know why he knew names he shouldn't have, why he asked for streets that didn't exist, why he disappeared into fog as if the world had swallowed him. But he was here, and the memory of him stays with me like a shadow at the edge of the street lamp, always just out of reach. I never spoke about it to anyone else. Not in town, not to my family. People would have called me crazy, but I still see him sometimes when the fog rolls in and the street is empty. And I keep thinking, maybe he isn't a man at all. Maybe he's just something else, walking slowly along the paths we think we know. I pulled into the Greenway Motel just as the sun had dipped low behind the hills, leaving a long shadow across the two-lane highway. The place looked tired, paint peeling from the wood siding, the neon sign flickering like it had a stutter, but it was the only stop for miles, and my feet were sore from a week of knocking on doors and hauling sample cases from town to town. I parked my car in front of room 7, the gravel crunching under my tires, and went inside to check in. The man at the desk was older, wore a dark suit that looked like it had been pressed years ago, and nodded without saying much. He handed me a brass key on a string. 75 cents, he said, almost in a whisper. I handed it over, and he simply nodded again. No welcome or anything, just the key swinging lightly in his hand. The room was small, with a cot against the wall and a single lamp on a nightstand. I set down my bag, washed my hands, and tried to relax. It was quiet. Too quiet. Even out on the highway, I'd expected to hear some cars. Here, there was nothing but the faint buzz of the neon outside my window. I fell asleep to that quiet, but sometime in the night, I woke to the sound of the door opening softly. I sat up, heart beating a little faster than I liked. Moonlight spilled across the floor from the window, and I could see someone in the doorway, a man in a dark suit carrying a black suitcase, standing completely still. I blinked, and he didn't move. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I'd imagined it. When I looked again, he was gone. I shook it off, thinking maybe someone was passing through the hall, and tried to sleep, but then I started noticing things. Down the hall, I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone was taking careful care not to make a sound. Every now and then, the door across from mine would open just a crack, a shadow leaning out and then disappearing. The footsteps never stopped. I lay in bed, listening, telling myself it was just other travelers or maybe rats in the walls. But the timing didn't make sense. They moved from one end of the hall to the other in moments, and there was no chatter or noise of luggage or doors slamming. At some point, I got out of bed and went to the window. The parking lot was empty. Nothing. I looked toward the office. Even there, the light was off, and the desk empty. I couldn't figure it out. Then I saw them. They came quietly, one by one, through the gravel lot. Every last one of them wore the same dark suit and carried the same black suitcase. They didn't talk, didn't even glance at the cars parked along the edge of the lot. They just walked in like they were moving towards some invisible line. I tried to count them, 6, 7, maybe 8, but the shadows made it hard to tell. They all went inside the motel, disappeared through the doors, and I never saw them leave. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every time I dozed, I'd jerk awake to the sound of that soft sliding of suitcase wheels against the floorboards, or the creak of a door opening somewhere far down the hall. I tried calling the office in the morning, but the phone on the wall was dead. I left the room, half expecting the clerk to be at the desk. Instead, the office was empty, dust on the counter, no sign anyone had been there for a long while. I went over to the registry book on the desk. It was old, leather-bound, the pages yellowed. I flipped through, expecting to see the names of the men I'd seen arrive. Nothing. Not a single entry for them. It was as if the last night's visitors had never existed. The entries before mine were all normal, names, towns, dates. But there was nothing out of place. I even checked my own name. My signature was there, like I had signed it hours ago, but nothing else. I asked around in the nearest town later, trying to see if anyone remembered the Greenway Motel having any guests recently. People shrugged, gave me polite smiles, said they hadn't heard a thing. One old man mentioned the place had been closed for months until a few weeks ago, but that didn't make sense. I'd seen the clerk, I'd paid him, I had a key in my hand. I drove away as soon as I could. On the road, I kept checking my rearview mirror. Every few miles, I thought I saw a figure on the shoulder, standing perfectly still, like they were watching. The figures were always at a distance, vague shapes that disappeared when I slowed down. By the time I got to my next stop, there was no one. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. I haven't returned to the Greenway Motel since. I don't talk about it much because no one believes a man who says he saw a group of travelers all dressed alike, moving in silence, and then vanished without a trace. Sometimes I wonder if it was some sort of dream, or if I got lost in my own imagination after long days on the road. But I remember the weight of those black suitcases, the way the moonlight hit their faces, pale and expressionless, and how the quiet stretched across the lot like a living thing. Even now, when I'm on the road and pull into a small motel, I find myself scanning the parking lot, counting cars, trying to make sure no one is standing too still, holding anything black in their hands. And sometimes when the night is quiet and the wind has died down, I swear I can hear the faint sound of wheels sliding across gravel, carrying secrets I'll never understand. I still sell my wares, still travel, but I drive past the Greenway Road now, without even slowing down. There's a feeling there I can't explain, like a pause in the world, like something is watching from the shadows of the buildings and the empty windows. I don't know why they were there or why the book didn't record them, but I know what I saw, and that's enough to make me keep moving, keep my eyes on the road, and never look back. I woke to a faint, strange glow coming through the cracks of the barn door. At first, I thought it was moonlight, maybe a full moon bouncing off the frost on the fields, but it wasn't the right color. It had this soft, almost blue tone that I hadn't seen before. I rubbed my eyes and sat up on the edge of my bed, the old mattress squeaking under me. The farmhouse was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you at night. I could hear the wind tugging at the loose boards on the roof, but the glow was steady, soft, and pulsing almost, like it was breathing. I grabbed my coat from the chair and slipped outside, my boots crunching in the dirt. The air was cold, sharper than usual, and it made my lungs sting. I walked toward the barn, keeping my eyes on the glow that leaked out in thin, wavering lines through the cracks of the weathered wood. I'd been keeping this farm alone since my father died a few years back. Nothing in that barn would glow. Not the animals, not the hay, not even the old tractors we rarely used. When I got closer, the sound of the animals hit me first. Not their usual restless noises or snorts. Silence. The cows in the stall were standing still, their heads turned toward the ceiling, eyes wide and fixed. The pigs had stopped rooting. The chickens weren't even shifting in their coops. I froze on the threshold, heart thudding, not sure if I should call out. "Anybody here?" I said softly, but the words seemed swallowed up by the cold night air. I pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The smell of hay was sharp, mingled with the faint tang of something metallic that didn't belong. The blue glow was stronger now, pooling across the floorboards and crawling up the posts of the barn. I could see it radiating from the rafters, but there was nothing up there that I could make out. No lanterns, no bulbs, not even the moon catching some high beam. Just light and a heavy quiet that made the air feel thick. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe a reflection from a car on the road, but the nearest road was over half a mile away and I hadn't heard any engines. Maybe some strange electrical leak. There wasn't any wiring near the loft, and the old generator had been dead for years. My brain kept bouncing around possibilities, none of which made sense, and the animals stayed frozen, their eyes unblinking, unflinching, fixed somewhere I couldn't see. I grabbed a lantern from the shelf and lit it, letting the warm glow cut into the bluish haze. The light didn't seem to touch the source, didn't compete with it. It just sat there in the middle of the barn, quiet and steady, making the shadows of the rafters stretch long across the floor. I took a step forward, then another, my boots creaking on the wooden boards. The animals didn't move. It felt like they were waiting, and I had no idea for what. I climbed the ladder to the loft slowly, trying to find a vantage point. The blue glow didn't seem to have a source, just shimmered in patches along the boards, like someone had spilled paint on the ceiling and it had started to hum. Or maybe I was imagining the hum. I thought I heard something, just a faint vibration, like a low hum of machinery, but it was too soft to be sure. Then I saw it, or at least the shape of it, a shadow in the blue light that didn't belong. It was massive, taller than the barn itself, pressing against the boards above. I squinted, trying to make out the edges. No face, no features I could understand, just a shape, dark against the pale glow. It moved slowly, not with intent, but as though it was observing the barn from above. The animals stayed still, unblinking, and I realized I hadn't breathed in a long moment. I climbed down, keeping my eyes on the shape, trying not to make a sound. I wanted to run, but I didn't know where to. Not with that thing so close and silent. My lantern was swinging, and for a moment the glow flared against the ceiling, and I thought I saw it shift, almost like it was sliding closer to the barn boards. I froze, trying to remind myself that the shape could be anything. A trick of light, the shadows, maybe my mind playing on the silence. Then the light changed. The blue shimmer pulsed, dimming for a few seconds, then brightening again, and the shadow above seemed to vanish, but the feeling of being watched didn't. The animals blinked slowly, almost in unison, and the glow retreated in the same slow, measured rhythm. I lowered the lantern to the floor, letting it sit between the hay bales, and stepped outside for a breath. The cold night air hit my face, and I thought for a moment that maybe I'd imagined it all. But when I looked back, the barn's outline was clear against the night, and through the cracks, the soft blue light still leaked out. I didn't hear anything move, didn't hear the animals stir, and the feeling of eyes on me stayed as I backed away toward the house. I tried to tell myself it was a reflection, or a trick of the moon, or maybe some new kind of barn fungus glowing in the damp air. It didn't matter. It wasn't something I could explain, and it wasn't going to wait for me to figure it out. I spent the rest of the night in the farmhouse, keeping one eye on the barn window. The glow came and went, sometimes flickering, sometimes steady, like it had its own rhythm. I stayed awake, smoking from my pipe, listening to the wind and the creak of the old house. Every now and then I thought I saw a shape move past the window, just beyond the frost or shadow. I didn't open the door. I didn't go back out. By morning, the blue light had faded. The barn looked normal in the sunlight. The animals acted back to their usual habits, lowing and scratching and clucking as if nothing had happened. I checked every board, every loft space, every nook and cranny, and found nothing. No signs of anything strange, no footprints, no scorch marks, nothing that could explain the glow. The animals seemed fine, though I noticed they still looked toward the rafters now and then, almost like they remembered something I couldn't see. I told myself it was over, that the night had been some fluke, some dream brought on by too many long hours and cold nights. I milked the cows, fed the pigs, swept the barn floor, and tried to let the thought go. But even during the day, sometimes when the wind hit the fields just right, or the light fell at a certain angle, I'd catch a flicker of that blue color in the corner of my eye. Not bright, not solid, just there, and the animals would glance upward again, like they hadn't forgotten either. I kept the barn doors shut tightly after that, no matter the weather. I didn't mention it to the neighbors. I didn't need anyone thinking I'd lost my mind. But every night when I sat in the farmhouse listening to the wind, I'd wonder. I'd hear the faint hum again sometimes, just under the floorboards or high in the rafters, and I'd swear I saw the shadows stretch differently than they should. Not like a thing moving, just watching. I haven't gone back to the loft after that night. I keep the lantern by the door just in case, and I still make my rounds, feed the animals, sweep the floors. The barn looks normal. Everything looks normal. But when the night falls and the wind cuts across the fields, I know that the blue light isn't gone. It's just waiting, watching. I can't explain it. I don't know what it was, but I know it was real because the animals knew it too. And they haven't stopped looking up since. It was 1957, and we'd driven out to Lake Wanola for a picnic. My wife Clara packed sandwiches, hard-boiled eggs, and a jug of lemonade. Our boy Henry was 9 then, and our daughter Ruth had just turned 6. We spread a blanket on the grass a little ways from the water, near where the birch trees thinned out and gave us a clear view of the sky. The lake was quiet that evening. Just a couple of fishermen in rowboats out near the far side, and the occasional sound of a screen door banging shut from the cabins scattered along the shore. The air was still warm, but you could feel the night creeping in, and the first stars were starting to poke through. We ate slow, talking about nothing in particular. Clara fussed with the basket. Henry kept trying to skip stones, even though he never got more than 2 skips. And Ruth lay flat on her back, staring upward, pointing out stars she said were twinkling funny. I remember leaning back on my elbows, looking at the sky. That was when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the clouds, but then I realized it wasn't moving like a cloud. Right above us, blocking out a patch of stars, there was a shape. It was triangular, with edges so sharp it looked unnatural against the sky. No lights on it, no sound at all, just a vast, dark form drifting slow and steady. I sat up and pointed. "Do you see that?" Clara looked up, then at me. "See what?" "That," I said, tracing the outline with my finger. "Right there, it's covering the stars." She squinted, shook her head. "I don't see anything." I turned to Henry. "Look there, son, above the birch tree tops." He tilted his head back, chewing his lip. "Just stars, Daddy." Ruth barely glanced up. "Nothing's there." She went back to pulling grass blades and tying them into knots. I stared back at the sky, and the thing was still there, big enough that it covered nearly half the visible stars above us. It moved so slow it was hard to notice at first, but if you kept your eyes fixed, you could see it creeping. I rubbed my eyes, looked again. Still there. I stood, shaded my brow even though it was night. The shape didn't waver. "Come on," I said, trying not to sound rattled. "You're telling me none of you can see that? It's right above us." Clara gave me a half smile. You held the kind you give someone when you think they're joking. "Maybe you've had too much sun." But I hadn't. I hadn't even touched the lemonade, let alone anything stronger. I kept staring, my chest tightening. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It was close enough that I could almost imagine texture to it, some kind of uneven surface. It blocked out stars as it moved, swallowing them one by one and revealing others on the opposite side. And still, no sound. No engine, no wind, nothing, just silence. I thought maybe the fishermen out on the lake would notice, but they went right on casting lines. Not a glance upward. The whole world seemed oblivious. I sat back down, trying to act calm, but my hand wouldn't stop gripping my knee. "I don't understand," I muttered. "What don't you understand?" Clara asked, folding the blanket corners over the leftover food. "You really don't see it?" She looked at me then in a way that made my stomach twist. Not annoyed, but concerned, like she thought I was sick. I tried to explain, pointing out how it moved, how it covered the stars, but the more I talked, the more uneasy everyone looked. Ruth asked if we could go home. Henry said I was making it up. But the thing kept drifting. Slowly, it angled toward the far side of the lake. I followed it with my eyes until it passed over the fishermen's boats. They didn't so much as raise their heads. Then it crossed over the ridge of trees beyond, and just like that, it was gone. The stars filled back in, every one of them clear and sharp. I sat there, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. The crickets chirped, the water lapped against the shore. Ruth tugged Clara's sleeve, asking for another cookie. The world went on like nothing strange had passed above it. The ride home was quiet. I didn't bring it up again, and neither did they. But I know what I saw. That black triangle, silent and massive, blotting out half the sky. And I'll never understand why I was the only one who could see it. It was 1953, and I was 23, working the late shift at the mill on the south end of town. The only way I got home most nights was the midnight bus, the one that came through after the taverns had closed and the streets had gone quiet. That night, I reached the stop on Main Street a few minutes early. The fog had rolled in heavy, so thick I couldn't even see the courthouse clock from across the square. There was only one other person sitting on the bench when I got there. A man I didn't recognize, wearing a suit that looked too fine for our town. Not flashy, just sharp. Dark jacket, pressed trousers, shoes that shined even in a weak streetlight. He sat upright, hands folded neatly over his knee like he was waiting for an interview. I gave him a polite nod and sat a little ways down. Most nights, the stop was empty, so it felt strange to have company. He spoke first. His voice was calm, steady. He asked if I worked at the mill. I said yes. He asked which one. There were 3 in town. I told him the South Mill. He started asking more. How many men worked there? Did they run all night? How often did the whistles blow? He wasn't nosy in a rude way, more like he was ticking boxes in his head. The kind of questions a man might ask if he were moving to town, maybe looking for work. But something about the way he phrased them stuck with me. He said things like, how much energy do they expend? And at what hours is the machinery most active? It wasn't the way locals talked. We'd ask how loud the whistles were, or if the pay was steady. His words felt clipped, precise. I tried asking him where he was from, but he dodged the question, said he was passing through and wanted to understand the activity here. I laughed and said, not much activity in this town after dark, except the factories. He didn't laugh with me. He just nodded like I'd confirmed something for him. The fog seemed to be getting thicker while we talked. The lamps along the street made little yellow cones that didn't stretch far. I couldn't even see the store windows behind us. It felt like we were sitting on a bench in the middle of nothing. After a few minutes, he stood up abruptly. No coat, no hat, just that suit. He smoothed his sleeve, looked down the street as if expecting someone, then turned back to me. I must be going, he said. I told him the bus wasn't due for another 5 minutes, but he shook his head. No, my time is elsewhere. And without another word, he stepped off the curb and walked straight across the road into the fog. I thought maybe he lived nearby, though I knew that across from the bus stop was nothing but an open field. I expected him to angle toward a side street or head for one of the houses farther down, but he didn't. He just kept walking directly into the field, the mist swallowing him up until he disappeared. I stayed seated, staring after him. The sound of his shoes on the pavement faded fast. After a few seconds, there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Just quiet. When the bus finally came, I looked again toward the field. Nothing but fog and empty space. The driver opened the door and said I looked pale. I asked him if he'd seen another man waiting there earlier. He shook his head. You're the only soul I've seen tonight. On the ride home, I kept thinking about that suit. Perfectly pressed, no speck of dust, not a wrinkle. I couldn't figure why a man dressed like that would be asking questions about the factories in a town nobody pays much attention to. The field he walked into. It stretches flat for a good half-mile before you hit the river. Even in the fog, you'd expect to see a shape, some movement, but there was nothing. He went in, and he was gone. I still took the midnight bus after that, but I never saw him again. It was 1957, and I was 17. Most nights back then, me and a few friends would drive the back roads outside of town because there wasn't much else to do. That night it was me, Robert Evans, his cousin June, and a boy named Larry Peters. Robert had just gotten his father's old Plymouth running again, and we were out testing it. The car wasn't pretty, but it held the 4 of us, and it was freedom, which was all we wanted. We'd taken County Road 12, the one that cuts through the woods and stays mostly empty after sundown. It was dark, the moon thin behind some clouds, and the air smelled damp like it might rain later. Robert was driving, Larry riding shotgun, me and June in the back. The radio was playing low, some country station, crackling in and out because reception on those roads was never good. We were halfway down a stretch with no houses when June leaned forward suddenly and asked, "Do you see that?" At first I thought she meant a deer. Robert eased off the gas, but she was pointing higher, out beyond the trees. I looked, and sure enough, above the tree line was a light. Not a star, not a plane, just this glowing shape. It wasn't moving the way a plane does, no blinking, no steady drift. It hung there, low enough you could see it wasn't natural sky. The glow was soft but wide, like the light had no source, just a ball of haze floating above the woods. Robert slowed the car until we rolled to a stop on the shoulder. Nobody said much for a minute. We just stared. I remember thinking maybe it was some kind of weather balloon, but that the color was wrong. It wasn't white or silver. It had this faint green tint, pulsing like it breathed. The car went quiet except for the idle of the engine. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered and died. Robert tried the key again, but it wouldn't catch. "Battery's fine," he muttered, turning it uselessly. Then the radio came alive on its own. Not with static, not with the country station we'd been listening to. It was music, clear and strong, like the signal had sharpened. Only it wasn't anything I recognized. The melody sounded modern, like something you'd hear in a club maybe, but slicker, faster. The singer's voice was bright, layered over an electric beat I couldn't place. It didn't sound like 1957 at all. Larry frowned and said, "What station is that? That's not from around here." Robert twisted the knob back and forth, but the dial didn't matter. The same song kept pouring through, louder the more he tried to change it. We all sat frozen, listening. June whispered, "That doesn't sound like anything I've heard before." She was right. The instruments, the rhythm, even the way the singer carried the notes. It was too strange, too ahead of us. The glowing shape above the trees shifted then, sliding slowly across the sky without noise. Not drifting like a balloon, not flying like a plane, just a steady, impossible glide, too smooth. It tilted once, the glow deepening, and I swear the whole inside of the car lit up with that green tint. Our faces, the seats, even the dash, all washed in it. The radio grew louder, nearly rattling the speakers. The song had words none of us could catch, like it was English but sped up or altered somehow. The singer kept repeating a phrase, clear but unfamiliar. I couldn't remember it later, not exactly. It slipped out of my mind as soon as it ended. Then, just as sudden as it started, the light pulled higher, rising above the tree line until it vanished into the clouds. The moment it disappeared, the radio cut to static, sharp and hollow. Robert tried the ignition again, and this time the car roared back like nothing had been wrong. Nobody said much. Robert pressed the gas, and we drove. The tires hummed on the road, the slide, and the only sound left was Duke Ellington faintly coming through once the station returned. We didn't stop until we hit the highway. Larry kept glancing out the window. June sat pressed against the door, staring at her hands, and Robert had both hands tight on the wheel. Nobody wanted to admit what we'd seen, not in so many words. When Robert finally dropped me at my house, the porch light looked strange, like it wasn't bright enough. The whole yard felt off, as though something had leaned close and stepped back just before I arrived. The next day at school, none of us mentioned it. We passed in the hallways, nodded, but kept quiet. Only later, years down the line, when music started to change, when the sounds on the radio shifted to electric rhythms and sharper voices, did I recognize pieces of that song. Not exactly the same, but close enough to stir the memory. What stuck most wasn't the light or the dead engine or even the song itself. It was the way the car felt when that glow filled it. Like we weren't supposed to be hearing it yet, like it had slipped through from someplace ahead of us. It was 1954, and I was running a modest farm a few miles outside of Stillwater, Oklahoma. My place wasn't much, just 200 acres of wheat and a handful of cattle. Nights were quiet out there, the kind of quiet where you could hear the wind change direction or a screen door slam from a mile off. That night I'd gone to bed early, nothing unusual, the same as I always did when I had a sunrise's worth of work waiting. I woke without knowing why. No noise I could place, just that unsettled feeling you sometimes get, like you've been nudged awake. The air felt different, thick, still, almost heavy. My bedroom window was open, and I could see the fog drifting low across the fields. Fog wasn't unheard of, but that thick, rolling kind usually stayed closer to the river. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and I noticed a glow through the haze. At first, I figured it was the moon catching the mist, but this was sharper, lower. A pale white light hung above the wheat, and I remember leaning closer to the window because it seemed like it was moving, fading, brightening, shifting. I pulled on my boots and went out, half thinking maybe a neighbor's truck had pulled into the far field. But no engine, no tires crunching gravel, nothing like that. Just silence. My dog, Duke, didn't follow me out. That was strange. He always barked at the smallest thing, but this time he stayed curled on the porch, ears flat, watching. As I crossed the yard, the glow dimmed, like it had been waiting for me to notice. By the time I reached the wheat, it was gone. But in its place was something else, something that froze me in my tracks. There in the field, cut into the wheat as clean as if a giant compass had traced it, was a circle. A perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across, the stalks flattened, darkened as though burned, but not smoking or charred. Just pressed flat and blackened at the base. I walked the edge of it, trying to make sense. My first thought was lightning, but the sky was clear, no storm all day, nothing like that. Besides, lightning strikes weren't neat. They splintered, scorched in jagged lines. This was too precise, too deliberate. That's when I saw him. A figure stood at the far edge of the circle, half swallowed by fog. Tall, lean, in what looked like a long coat that brushed his boots. For a second, I thought maybe it was a neighbor, someone wandering drunk or lost, but none of my neighbors carried themselves like that. He was ramrod straight, still, like he'd been waiting. I called out, "Hello there," my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No answer. He didn't move, just lifted a hand slowly, tipped the brim of a hat I hadn't noticed before. The motion was calm, almost polite. Then he turned and walked away into the fog. Not hurried, not stumbling, just steady steps until he faded into the gray. I wanted to follow, I truly did. But something in me said, don't. It wasn't fear exactly, not the kind that makes you run, but a heaviness in my gut telling me I wasn't meant to cross that circle. So I stayed where I was until I couldn't see him anymore. The fog seemed thicker then. I walked back to the house, my boots crunching loud in the damp soil, Duke whining low from the porch like he knew something I didn't. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, the fog lifted and the circle was still there, clearer than ever. The wheat inside lay flat, spiraled in one direction, edges sharp enough you could trace it like a ruler line. My neighbor Earl stopped by later that morning to borrow a wrench, and I showed him. He stood at the edge, chewing his tobacco slow, and finally said, "Wind'll do strange things." But his voice didn't sound convinced. He wouldn't step into it, just spat in the dirt and changed the subject. Over the next days I checked it often. The wheat never stood back up. It stayed pressed down, lifeless, while the rest of the field grew tall and green around it. No animals went near it. Even Duke gave it wide berth, circling far off when he chased rabbits. What stuck with me most wasn't the circle, though. It was that figure. The way he tipped his hat, as though acknowledging me, like this was something shared. He hadn't threatened me, hadn't rushed or vanished suddenly. Just a calm, silent gesture and a walk into the fog. I never saw him again. By harvest, the circle had turned yellow and dry, the stalks brittle, breaking underfoot. The rest of the field yielded fine, but that patch stayed dead. I plowed it under with the rest, yet when the new growth came up the next year, you could still see it faintly, darker, thinner. I didn't speak much about it after that. Folks in town had their share of stories, and I knew better than to add mine. But every time I walked that field, I thought about the circle and the man at the edge of it, tipping his hat before disappearing into the fog. We pulled into the diner a little after midnight. The place sat low against the highway, one of those squat buildings with a long row of windows, neon sign buzzing faintly over the roof. I was riding with Pete, hauling a load of machinery across state lines. We'd been driving most of the night, and my eyes were starting to blur against the white lines. Pete suggested we stop for coffee, and I didn't argue. The gravel crunched under the tires as we pulled in. The lot was empty, save for one old Ford parked crooked near the side. Inside, the lights were still on, humming a bit too bright for the hour. We climbed out, stretched stiff backs, and pushed through the glass door with its little silver handle. The place was quiet, save for a fan somewhere near the ceiling. A jukebox stood dark in the corner, and a few of the booths had crumbs scattered across them, like folks had just left. Behind the counter, a woman looked up from wiping down a stack of mugs. She was maybe in her 40s, hair tied back, face kind but tired. "Evenin'," she said with a small smile, like we weren't the first strays she'd seen roll in late. We slid onto stools at the counter. The seats squeaked under our weight. Pete cleared his throat. "2 coffees," he said. She nodded, reached for the pot, and poured. The smell of burnt beans filled the air, sharp but welcome after hours on the road. I cupped my hands around the mug, letting the heat soak in. "You boys headed west?" she asked. "Yeah," Pete said. "Long haul." She nodded again, quiet for a moment, then leaned a little closer over the counter. Her eyes shifted between us like she was debating something. Then, with a voice calm as if she were asking about the weather, she said, "Did you see them too?" He frowned, brow pulling tight. "See who?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She just gave that same small smile, like she knew something we didn't, then straightened up and carried the pot into the kitchen. The swinging door flapped once, then fell shut. Pete and I sat there a long minute, mugs steaming in our hands, neither of us speaking. The clock above the counter ticked soft but steady. The place felt different all of a sudden. Emptier, like the air had dropped a few degrees. I shifted on my stool, craning toward the kitchen door. No clatter of dishes, no running water, nothing. Just silence. "Maybe she's making more coffee," Pete muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. We waited another 5 minutes. Nobody came out. Pete tapped his fingers against the counter. Finally, he stood and walked over to the kitchen door, pushed it gently open. The hinges squeaked. "Well?" I asked. He stepped inside, disappeared for a beat, then came back shaking his head. "Nobody there," I laughed, though it came out thin. "What do you mean, nobody there?" "I mean the place is empty. Stove's cold, no lights on in the back, just boxes stacked up, like it ain't been used in weeks." I got up and checked for myself. He was right. The kitchen was bare, shelves dusty, floor swept clean. No half-washed dishes, no food smells, nothing. It looked like no one had cooked back there in a long time. But I'd seen her carry the pot through that door. Pete had too. Back at the counter, our mugs still sat steaming. Full. Coffee dark and fresh, like it had just been poured. We sat back down, not knowing what else to do. The neon sign buzzed faint through the glass, throwing a sickly pink glow across the room. My stomach churned. "You heard what she said," Pete murmured finally. I nodded. "Yeah." We didn't talk about it again, not then. We finished our coffees in silence. The clock ticked on. I swear, the place grew quieter with each passing minute, like the whole diner was holding its breath. When we finally stood to leave, I glanced back at the counter. The 2 mugs still sat there, but something about them seemed off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe the way the steam rose slower than it should have, or how the liquid inside didn't ripple when I set mine down. Outside, the highway stretched black and empty. The air was still. No crickets, no wind. Only the sound of our boots on gravel. We climbed back into the cab, shut the doors, and pulled out. The neon glow fell away in the rear view, swallowed by the night. For a while, neither of us spoke. The tires hummed, headlights cutting the dark. Finally, Pete cleared his throat. "You think she was asking about lights?" he said. I didn't answer right away. A few hours earlier, somewhere east of town, I had noticed something strange low over the fields. A pale glow drifting too smooth to be a plane, too steady to be a lantern. I hadn't mentioned it at the time. Figured my eyes were just playing tricks after so many miles. Now I wasn't so sure. Pete must have seen something too. The way he kept his hands tight on the wheel, staring hard at the road, told me enough. We didn't stop again that night, and we never went back to that diner. The children were out in the corn by dusk, laughing and blinking like a string of lanterns. I had the screen door propped and was rinsing a dish at the sink when Tommy came, tearing back first, boots clattering on the porch. He looked like every boy after a long chase, cheeks bright, hair plastered to his forehead, but he was pale in a way that didn't come from running. "Pa," he gasped, "there's a man in the corn." "Who's with you?" I asked, because you say that out of habit. "Who's with you? What did you do?" And he didn't answer for a second. His eyes were fixed on the field as if it might still be there. "Roger and Elsie ran to the house," he said. He asked me what year it was. "What did you tell him?" I set the dish down and felt the water chill. Tommy's voice went very small. "I told him. He said it twice, like he'd forgotten." He swallowed. "He wore a hat like Mr. Hargreaves used to wear, like a fedora. He was tall. He was white, Pa, like he had no color." Mary came out from the kitchen then, wiping her hands on a towel. She saw Tommy's face and the way he kept looking over my shoulder and went still. "What about the others?" she said. "They ran," Tommy answered. "Elsie screamed when she saw him. He didn't shout or anything. He just said, "What year is it?" and smiled. We looked at each other the way you do when something small has gone wrong and you are trying to find the sensible place to put it. The light had that thin quality right after the sun drops. The corn rusted to a darker green, the fireflies beginning again. I put my cap on and grabbed the lantern from the porch rail. "Stay here," Mary said to the children, though she didn't sound as sure as the words were supposed to be. I stepped into the field and took the rows, lantern held out so the light made a pale trail on the stalks. The corn husks whispered against each other. The faint smell of river muck and the general late summer sweat of everything out there filled my nose. I called, "Hello?" Low, the way you do when the place is supposed to be empty. My voice came back thin. The place where Tommy and the others said they'd been was a little wedge of flattened corn by the second row. The stalks lay like a small hand had smoothed them. It wasn't a big patch, only a few paces, but the way they bent was wrong, neat, not trampled. You could still see the dew on the leaves, and there were no footprints to speak of in the loam. When I knelt down, the dirt was dry on the surface, not like it's been pushed around by boots. There was a faint smear on a leaf, something like dust in a light crescent. I walked the rows for a while, calling the children's names. The sound of the lantern came back to me as if I were far away. The fireflies made a patchwork behind me, and a beetle clicked somewhere. At the edge of the field, near the old fence, Roscoe's ears pricked, and he gave one short bark. He didn't want to go in the grass. He wouldn't go. Roscoe is not a nervous dog. He does not usually decline a walk. I went back to the house when the children wouldn't calm down, and Mary kept telling them to go inside and wash their hands. We tried to make light of it. My sister thought of ghost stories. The kids insisted they'd been funny, but there was a grayness about the rest of the evening. Mary made tea and set the kettle on slow. The radio in the kitchen, the small Philco on top of the icebox, that night made a soft buzz and then played the farm report. I sat with the cup between my hands and couldn't get that man's voice out of my head. The calm way he'd asked, the pause as if searching for the proper answer. The next morning, I walked out to the field in daylight just to see again. The flattened wedge was still there, the stalks lying the same way, like a sheet folded and tucked in. I raked my fingers through the dirt, no prints. The children told the next-door neighbor, Mr. Bailey, who came down with his hat in his hand and frowned at the neatness of it. "You saw nothing?" I asked him. "No," he said slowly. But old Joe at the mill said his boy came in last night and wouldn't eat, said he thought someone was standing on his porch watching the stars. Those small things began to pile up. The hens on Mrs. Abernathy's place went silent at dusk for a few nights. The church bell had rung twice and then gone dead once during morning prayers, and the sexton swore he hadn't touched it. My wristwatch, I've had it for years, gained nearly 10 minutes overnight once and then righted itself when I tried to set it. I'm not a man to believe in omens, but you notice if a watch starts to have its own ideas. 3 days after the boys came home, Elsie told me she had seen the man again while she was bringing in the milk pails. She said she was crossing the thin patch of field near the lane, and there he was at the fence, leaning on a post as if he'd been standing there all afternoon. She said he looked right at her and didn't blink. She ran. Her voice slipped, like it might again, and she pressed her small hands over her mouth when she told it. I went out that evening with a better lantern and a neighbor's shotgun in the truck, though I never thought I'd need it. The corn made the same rustle in the wind. The sky had gone to the color of a tin roof. I eased the truck down the path and stopped. At the corner of the field by the ditch, I thought I could see a shape, a pale line between the stalks. But when I stepped out and walked the edge, there was nothing, only the blades and the smell of the earth and my boots scuffing the soil. That night, we left the kitchen light on and the children slept with open doors. I sat in the rocking chair with the lamp low and Roscoe at my feet and listened to the house live. Once, when everything was quiet, I heard a sound outside like the faint ticking of a far-off metronome, a rhythm that didn't belong to the farmhouse. Not a car, not a train, not an animal. It ran for a second and then went away. I told Mary and she said, "Probably some switch, Frank," and she folded the quilt over the children. I wanted to ask more questions, but there was only the small safety of everyday things: dishes, the calendar on the wall, the way the curtains caught the streetlight. A week passed and folks in town began to tell of their own little oddities. Mrs. Klein at the post office said she put a stack of letters on her counter, and when she turned back, one pile had slid to the floor, though no breeze could account for it. Hank from the creamery said his clocks had been wrong all week. One of them had stopped at 4 and refused to start again until he wound it an extra turn. People said the sky had looked odd over the river on Tuesday, a thin, pale band that didn't match any of the maps. They said it like people say, "You might have been out of town," a way to keep distance. I never saw that pale man close again. Once late, I thought I saw someone tall and pale in the hollow down by the old oak, but when I took the lantern and walked the path, the figure had vanished as if it had never been there at all. I asked Simpson at the feed store if he had seen anyone. He shook his head and said he hadn't. Still, when I passed the corner by the field, I found myself holding my breath, steady as if waiting for something to be right. The children got over it. Time does what time does, and their fear turned to dares and then to the business of school. But Tommy still looks toward the corn sometimes when we pass, the way a man looks toward a road he used to drive. Mary says not to let it bother me. I do the chores and I make sure the locks are set, and I keep the lamp by the door at night a little longer than I used to. I'm not telling anyone I know all I think. Folks have enough to mind as it is. Maybe it was a man who lost his way, or some joke. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But when the dusk comes and the fireflies start and our boy wants to stay out late a minute longer, I keep my eye on the corn. Once in a while, I reckon, you learn that some things you can't fit into a neat box, so you fold your hands and go on. We came upon it without meaning to. It was 1950, and Tommy and I had been out on the county road because that's what boys did when there was nothing special to do. Riding bikes until the spokes sang, then walking farther into the fields than our mothers liked. We found the lane that led past old Mr. Harrow's fence and kept going, through a gap in the hedgerow we'd never noticed before, and then across a little rise into a clearing I'd only seen from a hilltop once before. The grass there ran flat and wide, and the trees made a ring around it, nothing strange. I thought of it afterward as a bowl of green. What made it strange was the blanket in the middle of the bowl. It was spread smooth on the grass, a neat square of red and white checked cloth. On it sat a little enamel teapot, 2 cups, a couple of plates with bread and cold meat, a jar of preserves with the spoon still in. Steam rose off the teapot in thin white ropes, even though the day had come with a north wind that cut through your shirt. The cups were steaming, and the meat looked like someone had only just put it down. Tommy and I stopped at the tree line and looked at each other the way you do when you find something you know you ought not to touch. There weren't any tracks leading to the blanket. No boot prints, and no bicycle marks in the grass. The ground around it was unbruised. It was as if the picnic had been laid down and everyone had stepped away footless. We went closer. The plates were set just so, salt and pepper in shakers, a small knife, a folded serviette, everything ordinary, everything clean. The teapot had a neat, steady plume. I reached out because I'm stupid when I'm nervous and put my finger just above the spout. Heat. The metal was hot to the touch, warm enough that the steam had to be real. "Maybe someone's hiding," Tommy said, voice too loud in the meadow. "Like a prank. Old Harrow's grandsons, maybe." We called out then, the 2 of us, "Hello?" And the sound just strung itself into the trees. No voices answered, no footfalls. The hedgerow rustled, but only from birds, I told myself. We sat down because you sit when you don't know what else to do. We took sips from those steaming cups. They were bitter, not like the sweet tea Clara makes, but it tasted warm. We ate bread for a bit and listened. The watch on my wrist said it was a little past 4. Tommy's watch was a tick off, but near enough. It felt like a long time and a short time all at once. The sun was dropping toward the trees, but happily high enough that the bowl of meadow stayed bright. Tommy found a scrap of paper under a plate. "For 2, it read in careful script. That's all. No name, no time, no place. We could have left then. If we'd been sensible, we would have left. Instead, we went to the edge of the trees because Tommy wanted to see who might be watching us. Just beyond the line of oaks, something silver moved in the sky. I saw it first, a flash above the trees like the back of a fish. It came up slow and then slid, smooth as a coin tossed in the air. Not a plane. No engine note. No contrail. It laughed at the wind and at our shouts because it made no sound at all. The thing slipped on a level path and then passed out of sight into a bank of cloud, as if it had slipped behind the hem of the sky. When it went, the meadow felt thinner, like someone had pulled the wool off a blanket. Tommy swore under his breath. Did you see that? I remember how his face looked. He wasn't grinning the way he grinned at a circus wagon. He had the look of a man who'd been distracted by a sound in the night and found his house empty. We stood with the hedgerow behind us and the steam of the teapot fogging in the air. We poked around the trees for 40 minutes after that, and the woods gave only birdsong and the small creak of branches. The path we'd come on was there, but still no other tracks. The grass near the blanket somehow stayed dry where steam rose. That made no sense. The air tasted of metal for a beat, then it tasted like nothing at all. The radio in my head, if I had a radio then, was static. On the way back to the road, Tommy said he had a feeling he was being watched, not by someone in the bushes, but by the meadow itself, like the land had lent its attention to what had been placed on its center. I laughed because I'm stubborn, because you do what you can to push a feeling away, but I could feel he wasn't saying it for effect. He kept looking over his shoulder until his neck cramped. We walked back slow, and by the time we reached the county road, the blankness of the whole thing had settled into the center of my chest. I said nothing on the bikes. The hedgerow shut the meadow from us like a lid, and the world went to the business of ordinary things. Livestock lowing in the distance, a tractor coughing somewhere past Mr. Benton's. At home, I told Ma about the picnic, because that's what you do with small oddities. Tell someone who will call you sensible. She was wiping the table and stopped mid-swipe and said, "There's no picnic planned anywhere near here." Her fingers went white on the rag. I said it was probably a lark, a picnic left by gypsies or hobos. She gave me that look like I'd put sugar in the salt jar. "Don't go back there, Sam," she said, and folded her hands around the rag until the knuckles shone. I kept thinking about the silver thing. In the light, it had been pale as tin, flat, more like a disc than any bird I'd ever seen. It had no tail, no wings I could pick, and when it slid into cloud, there was no sound. Even now, I can't explain why nothing in the sky mentioned it afterward. The clouds didn't billow, they swallowed it whole. That evening, the street was quiet, and Tom's father called Tommy home early. We didn't meet again that night. I lay awake with the taste of that bitter tea in my mouth. And once or twice, I thought I could hear the soft hiss of steam like a kettle left to itself. The next day, we walked out with ropes and a couple of boards. Tommy wanted proof, wanted to take home a bit of the cheese to show at school. The spot in the meadow was empty. The grass lay flat where the blanket had been, but there were no crumbs, no saucer, no steam stains. The soil looked as if nothing had been there at all. The boards we carried felt useless in our hands, like tools for chores that didn't belong. We told boys at school, and they laughed at first. Then one of them, Frank Weaver, said his uncle had seen lights over the moor at dusk that week. A woman down in town swore she'd found a small ring of scorched earth when she'd gone to gather mushrooms. A mechanic at the garage said his dog had refused to go out at night for 2 nights. Not one person had seen the same thing we'd seen. Everyone's story fit in a pocket to be pulled out later. People called us dreamers, and maybe in the end, that's what we were. But when I passed the hedgerow on the way into town, I always slowed, looking through the gap as if the blanket might appear again and someone would be sitting on it, picking at preserves as if they'd been there all afternoon. Weeks went by and life trotted back to its ordinary pace. I mowed the lawn. I helped Ma with shopping. I spent evenings at the shop with Tommy and men who told stories about baseball scores and the county fair. The memory of the silver thing kept itself to the corner of my thoughts, a small ache that would arrive when the sky went flat and the streetlight hummed. Once, months later, I dreamed of a plate steaming and a cutlery line neat as a soldier. I woke up with the taste of bitter tea and the clean smell of metal. In the mornings, I'd tell myself I'd been foolish to believe anything odd, but by then you learn that some things refuse a tidy explanation and insist instead on staying strange. We never found who had laid the blanket. We never found the silver shape again. The meadow remained a meadow, the hedgerow a hedgerow. At times, though, when I'm walking past it now, grown a little wilder since the summer, I swear I see the grass lie down at the center for a blink, like a breath held and released. And I still think of that scrap of paper that said simply, "For two," and of the steam rising from the teapot, while no one watched. I was making my rounds the night I stopped believing my own eyes. It was 1950, and I had the night watch job at the Burlington Rail Yard out past the mill. Been doing it near on 8 years. Some folks thought it a quiet living, but the yard keeps a man awake if he lets it. A rhythm of rail and oil, the clank of couplers, the far-off breathing of sleeping engines. I knew every sleeper and splice on those tracks the way a farmer knows his fence posts. I always carried the same lantern, brass, glass, a little cloudy from the coal smoke, with a wick I tended like a pet. I left the tower at 11 and walked the yard in a loop, checking derails, greasing points, making a note on my pad to call old Tom in the tower every couple of hours. If anybody was fooling about on the cars, or if a switch had slipped, you heard me holler and they knew who to blame. That night, the sky was low and iron gray, a wind that had come up from nowhere and took the smell of the yard with it. Diesel, tar, wet wood. There'd been nothing in the log that day worth a clerk's eye. A local freight in at dusk, a string of empties left at the north lead, the usual. Still, when I went out the depot door, the first thing I noticed was how quiet the dogs were. There were usually a couple of mutts padding the fence line, barking at shadows. They'd gone silent, like someone told them to mind their manners. That small, wrong hush gave me a tightness in the chest I didn't like. Past midnight, I found the first oddity. I stopped at the north lead and set the lantern on a car step to oil a hinge. A freight had been pushed back there earlier. The cars sat in a neat line like sleeping men. I saw something move between them, a ripple at first, like a cat slipping through. I straightened, lamp in hand. A man was walking along the trackside, the sort you don't expect in a rail yard. A dark suit, hat pulled down, shoes that didn't have the scuff of a laborer. He carried nothing. He walked with that steady, even appetite of a man, unbothered. I called out, "Who's there?" on the sort of voice I used for hobos and kids climbing cars. No reply. The man kept walking, shoulders straight, under the moonless sky. He didn't glance at me. I figured he was some fellow who'd been left by the cars, hitchhiking fingers to a city. I'd seen plenty of types, but his clothes didn't match the place. The suit looked like it belonged in a bank or an office, not on ballast between boxcars. I lifted the lantern and swung the beam across him to get a better look. The light strobed along the cars, caught on the number plates, threw his shadow long and thin. Where the beam should have met him, there was only the wet gleam of the rail and, for the briefest heartbeat, a sheen in the air as if the night itself had warmed. Then he was gone. No step, no clatter, no ragged cloth whipping in the wind, just gone. I expected to hear a dust cloud or see a flash of coat as he crossed behind a car. There was nothing. The only thing that felt wrong was the little ring of heat the lantern had left on my palm for a second as I had raised it. I squared my shoulders and went after him. The tracks made a low metallic moan underfoot, like a stomach after a big meal. I walked between the standing cars and looked into the shadows, shining the lantern along the eaves and under the couplers. Nothing. Not a footprint in the cinder, not the smear of a shoe. I thought perhaps he'd slipped off the yard, but when I stood in the middle of the track and looked down toward the north spur, the steel rails, right where he had been standing, felt wrong. I put my gloved hand close and the metal gave back a heat that made me pull my fingers away. Rails are cold at night in winter. This was like putting your hand near a stove. I got Tom in the tower on the phone. He's a man who's seen 1,000 odd things on that roster and tells them like a baker rolls dough. Rough, familiar. "Tom," I said in a voice I was trying to keep normal, "come down and take a look at the north lead. Something's hot." A few minutes later, he came out with his wrench and his cap, complaining about engine lines being late and the tea going cold. He walked with that slow, careful gait of a man who keeps his balance on oily steps. He came right to where I'd stood and ran his hand along the rail. He frowned, the way he does when a coupling doesn't sit right. "That's warm," he said, like he discovered a miscount in the manifest. Too warm. Together we checked the sleepers, the bolts, the fish plates, everything that keeps rail on rail. The rails were solid, no sign of a fire, no scorched ties, but the steel itself carried a heat that steamed the damp at our gloves and made our breath come in quick little strokes. It smelled faintly of something like burned iron, a tinny, sharp scent like a struck horseshoe. Tom kept looking at the stretch of track as if expecting to see a mark or a print. He swore softly, then said, "Might be a hot box earlier, an axle sticking. Train could have been here and moved off." He checked his watch. There had been no train scheduled to that spur. We walked the length of the lead. Every rail we touched that passed the point carried that same stranger warmth, fading like a sun's aftertaste as we went farther away. I wanted to laugh at myself. I told myself I'd seen the glow from a lantern or the flash of a coat and my eyes had run away with me. But the rails had been warm, and when Tom told me later he'd felt it under his palm, his voice didn't have the huff of a man telling a tale. He was careful when he told it, as if careful speech might keep us safe. We wrote it in the log as any sensible men would. 12:10, north lead, unknown person, observed between cars, rails warm. The duty clerk put an N beside it and didn't bother the dispatcher if the shift would be otherwise quiet. Word had a way of making the yard small, and the yard was a place for gossip. Even so, in the carts and the lunchroom, the talk was quiet and quick. A sighting here, a strange warmth there. Nobody laughed too loud. That night I went back out for another lap, lantern simmering low. I kept expecting to see the figure again, to catch his sleeve or hear his shoes on the gravel. I saw nothing but cars and the bending of the night's cold. On my second pass by the old loading ramp, I heard a low humming, faint and steady, like a machine idling somewhere past sight. It had nothing to do with the locomotives in their berths. The big diesels were still and ringing in their sleep. The hum made the hair on my arms stand up. I stopped at the bridge and rested my lantern on the rail, looking down at its reflection. The beam cut the dark into two neat parts. In one of them, I thought I saw a man standing at the far end of the yard, hat upturned, looking back toward me. I waved my hand, an idiot's wave to a stranger in the night. The figure didn't move. Then, before I could blink, the light from the lantern caught nothing at all. A raw quiet settled again, full and heavy. I finished my rounds and locked the gate at 4, going home with the metal heat along my wrist like a rumor. I told my wife nothing at first. She'd had enough worry with the baby and the bills. Later, when I did tell her, she put her hands on my face and said I'd been out breathing creosote too long. She said the sleep mustn't be too deep and to leave the log be. She made me tea. I went back the next evening with a new lantern and a clean pad, thinking whatever had happened would be explainable in daylight. The rails were normal to the touch, cold and as predictable as they had been for years. The yard bustle smoothed into its ordinary pattern, and the men who'd whispered over their coffee in the bullpen pretended that the night's heat had been a trick of one too many cigarettes. I can't explain the warmth or the man in the dark suit or why the air seemed to hum that night. All I can tell is what I did. I kept the log, I told old Tom, and I made my rounds, lantern steady in hand. I slept with the window cracked because I was afraid of staying inside a room that didn't match what I'd seen. Sometimes, when I make the rounds now, I pause where the north lead bends and put my palm near the rail. The metal is always cool. But for a second, on a certain hour of the night, when the air sits like a lid on the yard, I feel a memory of heat along the steel, as if a heavy thing had been lifted away an instant before. It leaves a kind of hollow I can't fill, and I find myself staring a little longer down the line, waiting for a shadow to step between the cars, and for a man with a dark suit to walk free of the night. We were in the middle of the hymn when the lights dipped. I remember the moment because Mrs. Clark, our organist, had just closed the phrase and the congregation went on with the last line. The church was full for once. Men in their Sunday coats, women with hats, a clutch of teenagers in the back trying not to giggle. Reverend Jameson had his sermon laid open on the pulpit. He'd been talking about charity and steadiness, the sort of thing that makes people nod. The noon sun came through the high window over the chancel and cut the dust into pale boards. Then the bulbs dipped so the chandeliers hummed like something deep pulling the current, and for a second everything went gray, and the organ held a single thin thread of sound. The hymn fell apart in that hollow. Someone muttered. A small child began to cry. I could hear the church clock, the big brass face above the entrance, tick twice and then stop, like a man catching his breath. The lights came back on quick, not a full return, but a strobing to near normal. I felt the hair on my arms tighten with that tiny electric fear you get when something in the house isn't as it should be. Reverend Jameson glanced at the ceiling, the way a man who teaches sermons sometimes checks the weather in a room, and when he looked back, his face had a faint gray line along it I'd not seen before. Then, just after the organ went into the next verse, there came a sound from outside that made 20 people in the nave turn their heads at once. It wasn't a truck or the hum of the main line. It was inside the bones, a long, pitched note that hung and hung above the rooftop. It was not a simple hum. It had a high edge and a low belly at once, and it came to us through the thin panes of the windows like a thing pressing on the glass. Some bodies in the congregation stiffened. A few of the older men gripped their hymnals like life belts. Nobody spoke. The hum lasted maybe 10 seconds, though it felt like longer. In that span, the organist's fingers stopped on the keys. Reverend Jameson's mouth was open as if about to say something. The clock on the wall was still. When the sound dropped, it left the church somehow smaller. People leaned forward and listened until the sound had faded into the town's ordinary noises, a faraway hammer, the clink of glass from Jennings' store. Reverend Jameson closed his sermon slowly and apologized for the interruption, but his apology didn't sound meant for us. It sounded like a man addressing a congregation that might not be listening. Mrs. Clark said afterward she'd seen a flicker through the east window over the steeple. A reflection, she thought, a plane, perhaps. Pastor Jameson cleared his throat and said the electricity must have had a moment in the hum a passing train, or that the wind had given the church a note. The teenagers snickered once, and then went quiet because they had been told not to. The strange thing started before then, though no one pays much mind to small miscounts until something larger rolls in behind them. I'd noticed the church bell that morning when I came in. It had rung twice before the appointed hour, a quick, bright note that stopped before the number the sexton usually counts. Old Mr. Hargreaves said he'd seen the cattle down at his place in a neat ring, heads all facing the same way early that morning. Mary Keller Tuller told me her radio had given a static and spoken alone for a minute when she was setting the table. No music, just a thin mechanical whisper. When I got to the vestry to lay out the hymnals, I found them in order, and yet one of the hymn numbers had smudged ink as if someone had run a hand on it in haste. Those are the kinds of things people shrug off. A bell off its beat, a radio playing odd. We've all got oddities in a small place, but when the hum came and the lights faltered, it felt as if the day had taken a breath it had no business taking. After the service, a number of folks milled in the churchyard like they always did, to see who'd come, to trade a word, to plan a luncheon. The sky was clear, and the sunlight made the steeple a pale spear against it. I stood talking with Ruth Mason about the bazaar and old Mr. Keene's pies when I heard a man say, flat, "Did you see it?" There was a murmur. Ruth blinked. "See what?" "Up by the steeple," the man said. "I saw it plain as day." A few others stepped closer. Sarah Finch, who runs the post office, had a smear of dust on her cheek and a look like she had something held back. "It hung over the steeple," she said, "like a great plate of tin. No sound. Not a cloud. It just stood there." There was cold in the air suddenly, even with the sun on my back. Several in the group had gone back inside before me. I'd stayed to fold up the collection plates. The talk grew small and urgent. One of the elders, Mr. Cole, said he had seen a sliver of silver, and then the thing had gone. Another, Mrs. Lang, swore she'd seen nothing, and had kept her face to the ground through the whole fuss because she feared a draft. Some swore the object had been there only a beat. Others said it had hung for a long minute and then slipped up into the sky like a fish under the surface. I did not think the same as any of them. When I stepped out and craned my neck around the church tower, all I saw was the steeple plain and blue and a strip of cotton-clouded distance. There was no mark in the air and no twine of smoke. I watched the slate tiles for a long time, expecting some sign, an ash line, a scorch, but there was not. Still, I couldn't shrug it off. The stories did not line up, as stories seldom do. Ruth Mason's cousin had been at the west window and said he saw a shadow like the inside of a bowl. Mr. Cole swore it had been circular and flat. The young O'Neills who lived by the mill had stepped out and said they had glimpsed light like the flash of a mirror. A dozen little versions, all true to the teller. We had a parish picnic scheduled for the next afternoon, and talk of canceling it rose and fell like a tide. Reverend Jameson, who collects currents of people as a man takes in rain in a barrel, said they'd wait and see. He had a steady way with his voice that calms the room, and people trusted his calm. Still, the strangeness settled like dust on the hymnals. You would open them and find it there. I went home that afternoon to make tea and try to read the ledger. The house seemed small with the windows shut. My wife, Ellen, had the radio set low, the farm report, the briefs from the county, but I noticed when she turned it, the air came with a thin hiss afterward, a sound like paper rubbed hard. The clock on the mantel gained a minute, then lost it. Roscoe, our old terrier, refused to go out into the yard and paced against the door with his nails clicking like small questions. When I locked the back door, I felt like someone closing a book halfway through a page. The next morning, the paper had 3 column inches on it. A farmer 6 miles over had written that his hens had gone silent at midday, and his boy had seen a silver thing graze the horizon above the church. A man in town said his compass had wavered and then set. None of that is proof of anything. People say things. Still, over the next week, more folks came up to me at the grocer and at the co-op to say they had seen the steeple's shadow move odd at the hour of the morning bells. Others looked at me and said they had not seen anything but trusted those who did. Some were angry that talk of such things had come into church. Others were frightened on a level that you don't confess on a front porch. I went back to the church alone one afternoon at the hour the bells ring noon. I climbed the narrow stairs up the tower to the little window that looks out over Maine and the hedgerows. The air was thin and smelled of wet rope and old paint. I stood at the window and pressed my forehead to the cool glass and peered out at the street, where people walked with their shoulders to errands. For a long while I saw nothing but ordinary things. The butcher's boy, sweeping a child with a hoop, a dog that kept lifting and putting down its paw. I could not make myself believe the sky had been the place for such an object. Yet I could not make myself disbelieve the dozen honest faces that had told me otherwise. When I came down the stairs, the clock in the tower was 5 minutes on its way, though the mantel clocks and the store clock downtown all seemed to keep the day with their own small differences. The world goes on, and if a thing happens and passes, it doesn't always leave a scrap to pick at. That evening at dinner, Ellen asked if I had any clue what it meant. I had none. I told her what Reverend Jameson had said about staying steady, and she said that if the preacher was steady, then she could be steady as well. People kept talking. Some said it was a government contraption, some a machine from a traveling circus. A few whispered about messages from elsewhere. I don't know. I only know how it felt in the church when the lights dipped and the hum rolled over us like something laying a hand on the roof. I remember how a dozen faces looked up at once, and how afterwards we stood in the yard and did not exactly describe the same photograph. After a week, the talk faded into other things. Crops, a wedding, people needing rail tickets. The steeple remains, plain and bright. Some of the men still shake their heads slowly when they pass the churchyard, as if memorizing that moment in the mind's ledger. I go to service Sunday and watch for a flash at the east window. I run my fingers along the hymn book's spine as if that might supply steadiness. Sometimes, in the quiet of the pew, I think I hear a faint high note outside the town, like a string a ghost might play to keep time. I sit there and listen because what else does a person do when something inexplicable presses against his days but keep living through it and keep going home?